Chapter 1392. When she heard Zadie's words, Greywood, who was sitting on the chair, could not help but reveal an expression of "I knew it." She knew that Zadie would not easily fulfill his promise. He must be toying with Qinchuan. Everyone outside the meeting room was furious when they heard Chen Chongqing's words. Zadie was clearly toying with Qinchuan and all of them. However, Qinchuan did not seem to be surprised by this outcome at all. He looked at Zadie calmly and asked, "Are you sure you want to break your promise?" As he spoke, Qinchuan's figure was already tightly pressed against the space portal. As long as he willed it, he could enter the space portal in an instant and leave Iki planet. When Zadie saw that Qinchuan was about to leave, he couldn't help but reveal a playful look on his face. He said, "Did you really think that I was waiting for your praise and didn't do anything?" Before Zettel could finish his sentence, boundless void energy suddenly surged out from the surroundings of the dimensional portal and sealed it in an instant. When the space portal was completely sealed by the void energy, Zadie slowly stood up and asked Qinchuan, "Now, what other tricks do you have?" When everyone saw that Zadie had sealed the space portal, their expressions suddenly became extremely ugly. Originally, they thought that even if Qinchuan could not save them, he could at least escape unscathed. However, it seemed that Qinchuan had no way of escaping from Zadie's hands. Qinchuan did not answer Zadie's question. He immediately retreated to the side of everyone in a flash. At the same time, a disc array appeared in his hand. The disc array emitted a faint white light. It had been activated. Qinchuan raised his hand and threw the disc array in the middle of everyone, then flashed back into the meeting room. Before Qinchuan could completely enter the meeting room, the white light from the disc array enveloped everyone. The next moment, everyone's figures disappeared from outside the meeting room. All of this seemed to take a long time to describe, but in reality, it all happened in the blink of an eye. By the time Zadie realized that something was wrong, it was already too late to stop the teleportation. Zadie glanced at the sky outside the conference room, and then turned his gaze to Qinchuan. He asked, "You knew that I would go back on my word, and that's why you were so calm. Moreover, you were prepared, and that's why you dared to come back, right?" Zadie appeared to be very calm, but no one knew what kind of flames of anger were hidden under this calmness. "That's right. Although I'm not a particularly smart person, I still have to make some preparations when facing an ultimate existence." Qinchuan calmly said to Zadie, "I deliberately opened a space portal to use it to attract all your attention. When you think that everything is fine after you seal the space portal and let your guard down, I can use the power of the formation plate to send everyone away." Hearing Qinchuan's explanation, Zadie could not help but applaud Qinchuan. He said, "Amazing, really amazing. In such a situation where there's such a huge disparity in strength between the enemy and us, you can still maintain such a calm mind. You're really amazing." At this point, Zadie paused for a moment and then asked curiously, "But there's one thing I'm curious about. Why didn't you leave with them?" "Because of the soldiers who are still in the military camp." Qinchuan looked at Zadie. "If I leave too, you'll definitely destroy the entire Iki planet. Those 2 billion soldiers are innocent. I hope that they can all live well, walk out of the shadows of this period, and become cheerful again." Zadie was very surprised to hear Qinchuan's words. He looked at Qinchuan with a strange gaze and asked, "Do you really care about the lives of those lowly people?" Qinchuan shook his head and said, "They're not lowly people. They're all humans, just like us." "No, no, no." Zadie shook his head and said, "We're not humans, we're gods. I'm a god, you're a demigod. We're different from them. No matter what, I did stay for their sake." Qinchuan looked at Zadie and said, "What will it take for you to let them go?" Zadie grinned and said, "Since you care so much about the lives of these people, why don't we play a game? How about it?" Qinchuan looked at Zadie and asked, "What kind of game do you want to play?" If Qinchuan had a choice, he would not be willing to use so many people's lives to play this game with Zadie. Unfortunately, he had no choice but to passively accept Zadier's arrangement. Zadier pointed at his feet and said to Qinchuan, "I'll plant a seed on planet Iki. After 10 minutes, this seed will explode, and the entire planet will be destroyed. If you can successfully hit me within 10 minutes, you win. I'll let everyone on this planet go. Oh, except for you." A game was a game, but Qinchuan still had to be captured. Hearing Zadier's words, Qinchuan pursed his lips and said, "I agree to this game." Zadier grinned and stretched out a finger, sending a dark purple ball of light into planet Iki's core. Then, he took out a new hourglass and placed it on the table. He said to Qinchuan, "Now, the game begins." Before Zadier could finish his sentence, Qinchuan's figure flashed and pounced on Zadier. He was extremely fast, almost like a beam of light, arriving in an instant. However, although Qinchuan was fast, Zadier's reaction was even faster. His figure only moved an inch to the right, and he dodged Qinchuan's attack. Qinchuan lifted his leg and swept it across, but Zadier still dodged it calmly. Whoosh! A silver-white longsword suddenly appeared from the side and pierced toward Zadier. In an instant, it slashed hundreds of times at Zadier. However, Zadier was calm and unruffled. He moved around in the narrow space, as if he was taking a stroll in the park, easily dodging every attack. Not far away, Greybeard looked at Qinchuan, who was attacking Zadier wildly. She could not help but feel pity for him. In her opinion, unless Zadier was willing to go easy on him, Qinchuan would never be able to hit Zadier. The gap between Qinchuan and Zadier was just too big. Heavenly Demon Seal. Qinchuan summoned the Heavenly Demon Seal, and the figure and dragon figures attacked Zadier together with the Milky Way sword. The terrifying momentum instantly turned the conference room into ashes, and the power wreaked havoc on the ground. Unfortunately, it still couldn't hit Zadier. It couldn't even touch the cloak on Zadier's body. Even so, Qinchuan did not give up. He was still trying his best to attack. As long as he did not fall, he would try. Chapter 1393. In the Starry Sky. Lu Zi and the others stood together. Each of them had a complicated expression on their faces. Not long ago, they were teleported away from planet Iki by Qinchuan's interstellar teleportation disk. They were out of danger, but Qinchuan did not leave with them. Each of them knew very well that the reason Qinchuan did not leave was because of the others on planet Iki. "Qinchuan, he's really too stupid." Tian-san sighed. "He's a respectable fool." When everyone heard Tian-san's words, they did not know what to say. This time, Qinchuan saved all of their lives. For some of them, this was not the first time Qinchuan saved their lives. They owed Qinchuan too much. They might not be able to repay him in this lifetime. What should we do now? Huang Feng looked at everyone with a complicated expression. They were out of danger now, but Qinchuan stayed on planet Iki. If they abandoned Qinchuan just like that, they would not be able to get over the hurdle in their hearts. However, if they returned to planet Iki, whether they could help Qinchuan was secondary. The most important thing was that they would waste Qinchuan's good intentions. Qinchuan could send them away once when Zadie was not paying attention, but he might not be able to send them away a second time. "We can't go back." LVZ raised her eyes to look at the crowd. Her face was expressionless, but everyone could tell that she was actually feeling very uncomfortable. Hearing Lu Zi's words, Zhou Lin pursed her lips and said, "Then what should we do?" Go back to the capital of Starting Point and wait for him to come back." Lu Zi turned her head and looked in the direction of planet Iki. Her eyes were filled with determination. Planet Iki. The battle between Qinchuan and Zadier continued. However, rather than calling it a battle, it was more accurate to say that Zadier was toying with Qinchuan one-sidedly. 8 minutes had already passed, and Qinchuan had almost exhausted all his methods, but he still could not hit Zadier. He could not even touch the corner of Zadier's clothes. As the only spectator, This was the first time that Huicho saw that Qin Chuan actually had so many powerful moves. If Qin Chuan's opponent was someone below the realm of perfection, he would have definitely been beaten to death by Qin Chuan. If I were Zephyr, I might have already been defeated when Qin Chuan used Heaven's collapse of the 9 transformations of the Dragon Ball. However, even after Qin Chuan used Heaven's scale of the 9 transformations of the Dragon Ball, he was still unable to hit Zephyr. The gap between a demigod and a perfection existence is just too big. While Huicho was thinking about this, 9 minutes had already passed. Qin Chuan only had 1 minute left. At this time, Qin Chuan was already a little exhausted, but Zadier was still at ease. You still have 42 seconds. Zadier looked at Qin Chuan with a smile. When he saw that Qin Chuan was still unable to touch him even after using all his strength, he was in a good mood. This also made him realize that not everyone in the human race was as abnormal as you. Qin Chuan did not seem to hear Zadier's words and continued to attack. However, at this time, his attacks were becoming weaker and slower. Even with the strength of a demigod, after continuous high-intensity outbursts, he would feel exhausted. It's the last 30 seconds. Zadier smiled as he counted down for Qin Chuan. It was not because he was so kind as to remind Qin Chuan. He simply wanted to tease Qin Chuan and see how anxious Qin Chuan was. Huicho looked at Qin Chuan, who was gradually losing all his composure, and could not help but sigh. Qin Chuan was already hopeless. In other words, Qin Chuan did not have any hope of winning in the first place. It's the last 20 seconds. Zadier calmly dodged a punch and elegantly circled Qin Chuan. He came up behind Qin Chuan and leaned over to Qin Chuan's ear, saying, "You don't have much time left. Think about it now. Is it really worth sacrificing yourself for these lowly people?" Qin Chuan turned around and punched, but he still did not hit Zadier. He seemed to have been broken by Zadier's words and roared angrily, "It's worth it." Hearing Qin Chuan's roar, Zadier laughed and said, "Since you think it's worth it, then take it that it's worth it. However, you still have 10 seconds left." Qin Chuan suddenly swung his fist and used all his strength, but he could not even touch Zadier's expectations. 7. Qin Chuan controlled the Galaxy Sword to slash at Zadier's body, but Zadier easily dodged it. 6. Qin Chuan used the power of the law of space to imprison the space around Zadier. However, Zadier's body only paused for a moment before he regained his freedom. 5. Qin Chuan used the 7th transformation of the 9 transformations of the Dragon Ball, Sky Edge, but he still could not hit Zadier. 4. Qin Chuan used lightning evasion to instantly close the distance between him and Zadier. 3. Qin Chuan took out the Rune sword and brazenly stabbed it at Zadier's chest. 2. When Zadier retreated to avoid the Rune sword's attack, Qin Chuan roared, "Time reversal." 1. When the power of time reversal acted on Zadier's body, even though Zadier was already a rank 1 powerhouse, his body still involuntarily stagnated for a moment and returned to the position he was in a second ago. Pucci. The runic sword accurately pierced Zadier's heart and pierced through his body. In this game, at the last second when time was about to end, Qin Chuan made a desperate counterattack and successfully hit Zadier. When all this happened, the entire conference room fell into absolute silence. Qin Chuan and Zadier stood facing each other. Everything came to a standstill at this moment. At the table, Grey Chuan stared at Qin Chuan and Zadier in shock. When she saw the golden sword piercing Zadier's heart, she was completely stunned. She never would have thought that at the last second, Qin Chuan would actually find a glimmer of hope in a hopeless situation and hit Zadier. Moreover, Qin Chuan had stabbed Zadier's heart. Even if an ultimate existence was powerful, the heart was still one of its weaknesses. I won. Qin Chuan panted violently. His gaze was fixed on Zadier, his expression incomparably cold. Upon hearing Qin Chuan's words, Zadier slowly shifted his gaze away from the golden sword piercing his heart and turned to Qin Chuan's face. He looked at Qin Chuan with an extremely complicated gaze. There was shock, astonishment, and a sudden realization. No wonder you could rise so quickly and so amazingly. So the rune sword has actually fallen into your hands. Zadier's expression suddenly became very strange, as if he wanted to laugh, but felt that it was really difficult to laugh in the current situation. As a result, his expression became very strange. Chapter 1394. Zephyr did not expect Qin Chuan to take out the runic sword in the last 3 seconds. As the former owner of the runic sword, he knew the runic sword too well. If it were not for the sudden appearance of the runic sword, he would not have been momentarily distracted, and Qin Chuan would not have seized the opportunity to strike him with the power of time reversal. The runic sword. It's been too long since I last saw it. Zephyr gently raised his hand, as if he wanted to touch the blade of the runic sword. However, Qin Chuan suddenly exerted force and once again stabbed the runic sword into Zephyr's body, causing Zephyr to pause in his movement. I said I won. Qin Chuan stared sharply at Zephyr. He knew that it would be difficult to kill Zephyr with this strike, but if he did not pull the sword out, Zephyr would not be able to unleash much of his strength under the attack of the runic sword. This was his only chance to force Zephyr to retrieve the dark purple ball of light in the planet's core. He could not miss it. When Zephyr heard Qin Chuan's words, he suddenly sneered and said, "You're so noisy." As he spoke, Zephyr had already raised his hand and grabbed the blade of the runic sword. He exerted a little force and pulled the runic sword out of his body by an inch. When dark purple blood flowed out of the wound, he grinned at Qin Chuan and said, "Since you can't kill me, you'll have to be careful that I don't kill you later." Zephyr's attitude was very clear. He would never admit the result of the game. Although Qin Chuan had expected this, he still felt extremely angry when he saw Zephyr break his promise without any psychological burden. In that case, let's go. Go? Go where? When Zeder heard Qin Chuan's words, he was obviously stunned. When Qin Chuan took out a disc array, Zeder immediately understood what Qin Chuan meant. When he wanted to put some distance between him and Qin Chuan had already activated the disc array. A pale white light instantly enveloped everyone in the conference room and teleported them away from planet Iki. In the void, a hazy light flickered, and the next moment, 3 figures appeared. Zeder looked around and frowned slightly. He did not say anything. He thought that Qin Chuan would teleport them into the ambush circle that he had set up in advance, but in the end it was just to leave Iki planet? There's no need to think about it. There's no ambush. I just teleported us away from planet Iki. Qin Chuan looked at Zendil gloomily. This was a decision he had made in desperation. Only by letting Zendil leave planet Iki would the others on planet Iki have a chance to survive. You're really an idiot. Zeder sneered. Have you forgotten the void power I left in planet Iki's core? Hearing Zeder's words, Qin Chuan's expression changed slightly. At this moment, Zeder suddenly lifted his leg and kicked Qin Chuan's chest. Qin Chuan's body immediately retreated backward. At the same time, the rune sword that pierced Zeder's heart was pulled out. Pfft! A large amount of blood gushed out of Zeder's heart. If such an injury appeared on a low-level cultivator, they might be on the verge of death or even dead. However, for Zeder, although such an injury would affect his combat power, it was still far from enough to kill him. Zeder did not care about Qin Chuan. He raised his hand and gently waved at the wound on his heart. A large amount of void power surged toward the wound and healed the wound almost instantly. As a god, it would be too depressing if I were to die from such a method. Zeder looked at Qin Chuan with a smile. He seemed to have forgotten the previous unhappiness and became cheerful again. Qin Chuan gripped the rune sword tightly and looked at Zeder warily. In terms of strength, he was no match for Zeder at all. He could deal with Zeder earlier because Zeder was not serious. Now, Zeder was probably going to get serious. When Qin Chuan thought of this, Zadier suddenly appeared in front of him and punched him in the abdomen without any warning. When Qin Chuan's abdomen was hit hard, a gush of void power suddenly surged out and imprisoned his body in place. Immediately after, Zadier attacked again and hit Qin Chuan's back with his elbow. Just 2 hits were enough to make Qin Chuan vomit mouthfuls of blood. His aura was weak and he looked like a dying man. Zadier looked at Qin Chuan's forehead full of sweat and smiled coldly. I hate people like you the most. You pretend to be calm and righteous, but you're actually scared to death. Zadier reached out and grabbed Qin Chuan's hair, forcibly lifting Qin Chuan's head. He said coldly, remember, if you don't have the strength, it's best not to pretend too much. If it were not for His Majesty's request for Zadier to capture Qin Chuan alive, Zadier would have killed Qin Chuan just now. Not far away, Greycastle saw this scene and could not help but sigh. She originally thought that Qin Chuan had the chance to complete the magnificent feat of going against the gods and leave a strong mark in history. Now, it seemed that she had overestimated Qin Chuan and underestimated Zadier, a first-grade expert. Let's go. Zadier used void energy to tie Qin Chuan up, then prepared to leave with Qin Chuan and Greycastle. At this moment, Zadier felt something and suddenly turned his head to look toward the east. In the pitch-black universe, the shadow of a person slowly appeared. Its aura was long, desolate, and simple. Looking at the shadow, Zadier smiled coldly and said, You finally can't help but stand up? Faced with Zadier's cold smile, the shadow slowly opened its mouth and said calmly, You can't take him away. The him that the shadow was referring to was naturally Qin Chuan. Hearing the shadow's words, Zadier smiled disdainfully and said, Firmament, if you really want me to let him go, why don't you just descend and talk to me directly? You're too arrogant if you want me to retreat with just your will. Firmament. When they heard Zadier's words, the trapped Qin Chuan and Greycastle subconsciously looked at the shadow. So this person was Firmament. In the face of Zadier's provocation, Firmament calmly replied, My main body is on the way. If you're not afraid, you can wait for me for 3 minutes. Hearing Firmament's words, Zadier laughed and said, We're all existences of the same level. Why should I be afraid of you? Besides, you want me to wait for you, so do I have to wait for you? Don't I care about my reputation? As he spoke, Zadier had already carried Qin Chuan and Greycastle in the direction of the Holy Cluster. Only an idiot would stay where he was and wait for Firmament to come. Chapter 1395. Seeing that Zadier was about to leave, Firmament's shadow had no choice but to stop him. He raised his hand and waved it. An extremely mysterious force enveloped Zadier. Zadier sneered when he saw this. He countered Firmament's attack with the void energy. Then, he smiled coldly at Firmament and said, I know that your real body should be extracting the void energy from planet Iki's core. That's why you need some time. I didn't expect an old man like you to be like that little guy Qin Chuan. You both like to show great mercy. All this while, Zadier had always believed that the strong should be lonely and pursue themselves. They should never be bound by other things. The so-called friends, the so-called benevolence, these were all useless trash that should be thrown away. Hearing Zadier's words, Firmament said indifferently, Zadier, the reason you can become a rank 1 powerhouse is that you stole all the power of the church. You have never experienced the entire process of transformation, so you don't understand. You don't understand. Firmament's words were like a sharp sword that pierced Zadier's heart. Firmament indeed did not understand because his strength came from the church. He did not rely on his own talent to cultivate. It seemed like he had reached the top in a single bound, but in fact, he lacked a lot of experience and comprehension. This was a regret that he could never make up for in his life. It was also because of this that Zadier became unscrupulous and reckless after obtaining this incomparably powerful power. And now, Firmament was saying these words to him as if he had experienced it before. Although it did not hurt him much, it was extremely insulting. "You're courting death." Zadir was furious. He was completely furious. He did not want to leave anymore. He stayed where he was. He wanted Firmament to pay a painful price for his words and actions. Woo! All of a sudden, a large amount of void energy appeared around the Firmament's shadow. The void energy wrapped around the Firmament's shadow and instantly shattered the Firmament's shadow. "I'll wait here for you to come and die." At the very last moment before Firmament's shadow collapsed, Zedder uttered these words with a gloomy expression. Upon seeing this, Qinchuan, who was not far away, could not help but have mixed feelings. Whether it was compared to heaven or Zadir, he was far too inferior. In fact, he was not even qualified to be compared to the two of them. Who do you think is stronger, Chang Tian or Zendir? Suddenly, Huichu turned to look at Qinchuan and asked a very special question. Upon hearing Huichu's words, Qinchuan replied without hesitation, "Zadie." Greycastle was a little surprised to hear this. He asked curiously, "Why Zadir? He just became a perfected being not too long ago." Qinchuan turned to look at Greychong and replied, "To be precise, Zendir is a rank 1 expert, not a paragon. It's just a title. That's secondary." Greycastle continued to ask, "You should answer my question. Why do you think Zadie is stronger?" Qinchuan looked at Greycastle and did not answer this question. Instead, he asked, "It's just a title. Is it worth your hatred for humans for so many years?" Upon hearing Qinchuan's words, Greycastle could not help but frown slightly. He said, "These are two different things. Rank 1 and perfected being were on the same level, so it was not a problem to call Zadie whatever you wanted. However, Zerg and the Sacred Ones were worlds apart. In Greycastle's opinion, calling Zadie a perfected being did not have any other meaning. However, calling the Sacred Ones Zerg was an insult to them. Qinchuan smiled and said to Greycastle, "Actually, I had something to say that day, but I did not dare to say it in front of the Sacred Emperor. Only those who have the courage to face their past can be considered a true expert." At this point, Qinchuan did not wait for Greycastle to say anything and continued, "Now, let me answer your question. Although Zadie has just advanced to rank 1 not long ago, don't forget that his strength did not come from his own cultivation talent. Instead, he stole the power of the arcane. In other words, Zadie is as strong as the arcane was back then. I think Zadie is stronger than heaven because I think the arcane was stronger than heaven in the past." Upon hearing Qinchuan's explanation, Greycastle finally understood why Qinchuan said that Zadie was stronger than heaven. It turned out that Qinchuan believed that the arcane was stronger than heaven. However, right after that, Qinchuan continued, "This is just a guess of mine because I don't know to what extent Zadir has control over the power that originally belonged to the Void Spirit, and to what extent he can use it." Greycastle nodded and said, "I understand what you mean. It's like a piece of clothing. The arcane would fit the arcane well. Although Zadie can wear it, it might not fit him. Perhaps it needs to be tailored to fit him." Upon hearing Greycastle's words, Qinchuan smiled and said, "That's a good example." Upon seeing the smile on Qinchuan's face, Greycastle asked curiously, "You are now Zadie's prisoner. If the arcane is defeated, I'm afraid you won't have a good ending. Aren't you afraid at all?" Qinchuan glanced at Greycastle and said, "You are also a prisoner. Aren't you afraid?" "Zadie won't kill me," Greycastle said to Qinchuan. "I'm different from you. I'm not afraid of Zadie either." Qinchuan smiled. "It's not like I don't have any other trump cards." Upon hearing Qinchuan's words, Greycastle was very surprised. She did not expect Qinchuan to still have a trump card hidden. Just as she was curious about what Qinchuan's trump card was, a figure in blue flew over from afar and stood in front of Zadie. This person in blue had the appearance of a middle-aged man. He looked cultured and elegant, and his aura was restrained. He was unfathomable. The only person who could come here at this time and stand in front of Zadie so calmly could only be Arcane. However, Arcane's appearance did not look as high-end and classy as Qinchuan had imagined. Instead, he looked like an ordinary person. That's right, an ordinary person. You're finally here. Zadie stared at Arcane with a sharp gaze. He looked as if Arcane was his nemesis who had killed his father. He could not live under the same sky as him. Arcane did not immediately respond to Zadie. He first glanced at Qinchuan. After confirming that Qinchuan's life was not in danger for the time being, he turned his gaze to Zadie and said calmly, "Let him go, and I won't pursue the other things you did in the celestial cluster." Upon hearing Arcane's words, Zadie smiled coldly and said, "If you want me to let him go, sure. Then defeat me and take him back from me. I've heard of you long ago. Today, I'd like to see how powerful Arcane is." Chapter 1396. Chang Tian sighed softly when he heard Zephyr's words. "I've met Su Ling before. Compared to him, you're too inferior in all aspects." Zephyr's expression suddenly became extremely ferocious when he heard Chang Tian's words. A terrifying aura erupted from his body and enveloped this part of the world, causing the universe to tremble. "The thing I hate the most in my life is when people compare me to that old man." Zephyr roared angrily. Void energy surged out and turned into a giant hand that blotted out the sky and grabbed at Chang Tian. Chang Tian did not dodge when he saw this and allowed the giant hand to land on him. However, the giant hand did not cause any harm to Chang Tian. It did not even make Chang Tian move an inch. Chang Tian looked at Zephyr calmly and said, "Do you know that in my eyes, you're just a child holding a butcher's knife? Although the butcher's knife has fatal lethality, a child does not have the ability to fully utilize the butcher's lethality." Before Chang Tian could finish his sentence, the giant hand that was grabbing him crumbled inch by inch and turned into balls of void energy that dissipated. Zephyr was furious when he saw this. He hated Chang Tian to the core and hated Chang Tian's nonchalant attitude. The calmer Chang Tian was, the more he wanted to smash Chang Tian's entire face. "Die!" Zephyr raised his hand and clenched it at Chang Tian. An extremely vast and mighty force was born from the unseen world and enveloped Chang Tian's surroundings. It turned into a wisp of dark purple smoke that exuded a terrifying pressure. Divine power. Almost subconsciously, this word popped into Qinchuan's mind. Only the power of a true god could possess such an awe-inspiring aura. Chang Tian's expression finally turned solemn in the face of Zephyr's furious attack. Before the dark purple smoke came into contact with him, a faint white smoke had already appeared around him. While protecting Chang Tian, the faint white smoke was also expelling the dark purple smoke that was closing in on him. This scene looked ordinary, but Qinchuan could see that there was a great terror hidden within. What puzzled Qinchuan the most was that both the dark purple smoke released by Zephyr and the faint white smoke released by Chang Tian gave him an indescribable sense of familiarity. He seemed to have seen this strange power somewhere before. However, he really could not remember where he had seen this power before. At this moment, both Heaven and Zephyr had become serious. As their divine power surged, Qinchuan seemed to be able to see the birth and destruction of stars, the collapse and reconstruction of space, and even the acceleration and reversal of time. All of this seemed extremely mysterious, and one could not help but be mesmerized by it. "Don't look!" At this moment, a low shout suddenly sounded in Qinchuan's ears, waking Qinchuan up with a start. Greichuan looked at Qinchuan and said in a deep voice, "The battle between Chang Tian and Zephyr involves divine power. It's not something that demigods like us can easily explore. If you continue to watch, you might be lost in it for the rest of your life and never wake up again." Hearing Greichuan's words, Qinchuan looked at Greichuan with some gratitude and said, "Thank you." If Greichuan had not woken him up just now, he might really have been lost in it unknowingly. Hearing Qinchuan's gratitude, Greichuan coldly snorted and said, "No need to thank me. Don't forget, we are enemies." After reminding Qinchuan just now, Greichuan finally realized that she and Qinchuan were enemies. When she saw that Qinchuan was about to fall into it, she should have been happy. Instead, she could not help but remind Qinchuan and save Qinchuan. Seeing the cold expression on Greichuan's face, Qinchuan smiled and said, "We are indeed enemies. I have killed many of your companions, and you have also harmed my companions. However, this does not stop me from thanking you for saving me just now. If we meet on the battlefield in the future, I will let you go once to repay your kindness." Qinchuan knew that the grudge between him and Greichuan could not be written off so easily. The problem was too complicated and difficult to solve. However, these were two different matters. He still had to repay the favor of saving his life. Greichuan did not continue the topic with Qinchuan. Instead, she changed the topic and asked Qinchuan, "How confident do you think heaven is in defeating Zendir?" Qinchuan thought for a moment and replied, "To be honest, I don't really understand a battle at this level, so it's not easy for me to make a judgment. However, I guess that it won't be easy to determine a winner between the two of them. It will most likely be a draw." That's right, the smoke surrounding their bodies should be divine power. Greichuan nodded and said, "That is indeed divine power. It is also the reason why you are so obsessed with it. In this universe, there is no cultivator who can resist the temptation of divine power. It is a power that everyone in the world desires to control." When she mentioned divine power, Greichuan's face could not help but reveal a look of yearning. If nothing unexpected happened, it would not be long before he could control such power too. Hearing Greichuan's words, Qinchuan fell into deep thought. He felt very familiar with the divine power in the form of smoke. He should have seen this form of divine power before, but he really could not remember where he had seen it. At this moment, Greichuan spoke again. "The runic sword is a divine artifact, right? But I saw the runic sword in your hand just now. It doesn't look like a divine artifact." When Qinchuan had used the runic sword to assassinate Zendir, Zendir had mentioned the name of the runic sword. Thus, Greichuan knew that the golden blade in Qinchuan's hand was the famous runic sword. However, although the runic sword was a divine artifact, it looked very ordinary. Moreover, it did not cause much damage to Zendir. It did not seem to be very powerful. Greichuan had already known about the existence of the runic sword when he had met the sage emperor. Thus, Qinchuan had nothing to hide. He nodded and said, "That is indeed the runic sword," but, at this point, Qinchuan suddenly stopped. Greichuan looked at Qinchuan and asked curiously, "But what?" Hearing Greichuan's words, Qinchuan exclaimed in a low voice and said excitedly, "I know! I remember now! I know where I have seen this power before." Greichuan heard Qinchuan's excited exclamation and her face was full of confusion. What was Qinchuan saying? Why couldn't she understand? However, at this moment, Qinchuan was not in the mood to pay attention to Greichuan because he had already remembered where he had seen a similar power before. The land of exile, the carefree secret realm, the carefree residence. The green smoke in the mysterious portrait was almost exactly the same as the divine power that Heaven and Zendir had displayed. Chapter 1397. When he recalled everything, Qinchuan's mind replayed the scene in Carefree Residence like a flashlight. He entered Carefree Residence alone and saw a portrait hanging on the wall. The person in the portrait was dressed in white and holding a long sword. The person in the portrait disappeared, and the long sword turned into a wisp of green smoke that wrapped around the Rune sword. For a long time after that, the green smoke had helped Qinchuan many times. All this time, Qinchuan had not figured out the origin of the green smoke. Later on, as Qinchuan became stronger and stronger, the green smoke lost its use, and had been lingering around the Rune sword. Now that he recalled this matter, Qin Chuan was surprised to find that the green smoke had disappeared at some point in time. Be it Zadier's divine power or Firmament's divine power, they are no different from the green smoke in terms of form. Perhaps the green smoke is a type of divine power. Otherwise, it wouldn't have caused the rune sword to tremble. Qin Chuan frowned and looked down at the rune sword in his hand. If it weren't for what happened today, he would have almost forgotten about the existence of the green smoke. However, the green smoke had disappeared from the rune sword, so where did it go? Qin Chuan searched his brain and body, hoping to find traces of the green smoke. However, there was no result at all. Rune sword, do you still remember that wisp of green smoke? Qin Chuan had no choice but to ask the rune sword about the green smoke. He didn't know when the green smoke had disappeared, but the rune sword should remember. In the face of Qin Chuan's question, the rune sword quickly gave a response. A wisp of green smoke slowly emerged from the rune sword, and the green smoke wandered around the rune sword. It looked extremely mystical. However, this scene only appeared for a moment before it disappeared. Apart from Qin Chuan, no one else noticed this scene. When Qin Chuan saw the green smoke appear, he was somewhat surprised. So this green smoke has always been here, but you've hidden it. Speaking of which, what exactly is this green smoke? When Qin Chuan asked again, the rune sword gave an answer that made Qin Chuan somewhat confused. Divine prose. This wisp of green smoke was formed by the divine prose. Qin Chuan would never have thought that the divine prose he had been searching for had already been obtained by him, and was even under the control of the rune sword. However, since they had already obtained the divine prose, why didn't the rune sword tell him about it, or use the divine prose to heal its injuries? In response to Qin Chuan's new question, the rune sword responded once again. It was not that the rune sword did not want to use the power of the godly text to heal its wounds, but because this wisp of green smoke was an incomplete godly text, not a complete one. As for why it didn't tell Qin Chuan about this matter, it was because, strictly speaking, this wisp of green smoke was not a divine prose, so it didn't make much sense to tell Qin Chuan about it. After learning from the rune sword that the green smoke was an incomplete divine prose, Qin Chuan asked curiously, "Where is the remaining divine prose? How do we complete the divine prose?" At this moment, Qin Chuan was like a million wise, full of doubts and curiosity about everything. The rune sword responded to Qin Chuan's doubts and curiosity again. In order to complete the divine prose, they needed to find the other incomplete divine prose. The other incomplete divine prose should also be in the land of exile, but they had not been discovered yet. In fact, Qin Chuan's idea of looking for strange places in the land of exile could be said to be correct, but unfortunately, the remaining incomplete divine prose was not in those strange places. Perhaps Qin Chuan should go to the carefree secret realm again. After we get out of danger this time, we'll go back and take a look at the carefree secret realm again. At this time, Qin Chuan could not wait to return to the land of exile and go to the carefree secret realm to see if he could find the new divine prose. By the way, do you know who the person in the portrait is? Qin Chuan was a little curious. Who was the person in white holding a long sword? It couldn't be that carefree man, right? This time, the rune sword did not respond, but Qin Chuan guessed some answers from the silence of the rune sword. That person is you, right? Qin Chuan pursed his lips, and a subtle look appeared on his face. Besides you, Qin Chuan could not think of any other answer. Thinking of this, Qin Chuan could not help but sigh. He realized that ever since he rose to power, he had been living in the shadow of you. Whether it was the rune sword, the talisman array, or even the power of law and the divine prose, all of these were inseparable from you. Yu's shadow was involved in all of them. He felt like he was Yu's shadow, walking the path that you had walked before. I want to know, is you also practicing the thunder-devouring scripture? I can practice the thunder-devouring scripture because my talent rune is thunder. Is Yu's talent rune also thunder? He should have time, right? Qin Chuan had too many questions in his heart that he needed someone to answer for him. No. This time, the rune sword responded. Yu's practice was not the thunder-devouring scripture. As for what Yu's practice was, the rune sword did not tell Qin Chuan. However, for Qin Chuan this answer was enough. Fortunately, he is not practicing the thunder-devouring scripture. Otherwise, I would really suspect that I am his substitute. Qin Chuan smiled silently. However, he did not feel much relief in his heart. Instead, his mood became even heavier. Qin Chuan even had the urge to ask Zadier to take him away and go to the Void Empire to see Yu. He desperately wanted to see what kind of person Yu was with his own eyes. Qin Chuan and the rune sword communicated through their minds, so Huizhong did not know what Qin Chuan was doing at this time. In her eyes, Qin Chuan's behavior was extremely strange, like a madman. Huizhong looked at Qin Chuan, frowning, laughing, shocked, and worried. It was as if dozens of people were squeezed into Qin Chuan's body, showing different emotions. It was extremely strange. Is there something wrong with your brain? Huizhong looked at Qin Chuan and frowned slightly. She felt that something was wrong with Qin Chuan. Hearing Huizhong's words, Qin Chuan turned to look at Huizhong and said, I was thinking about something just now and was a little lost. I'm fine. With that, Qin Chuan turned to look at Song Tian and Zadier. Song Tian and Zadier's battle was still going on. It was still very dangerous. No one could tell who had the upper hand and who was at a disadvantage. Chapter 1398. Asterisk boom. Asterisk a dark purple ball of light the size of a thumb suddenly exploded beside Chong Tian. The terrifying impact was enough to destroy an entire galaxy, but Zetter had controlled such an astonishing destructive power within the narrow range of the machine, maximizing its lethality to the extreme. Freeze! Song Tian growled. Before the power of the explosion could spread, it was fixed in place. When Song Tian raised his hand and swept it across the area, the explosion disappeared without a trace. It was as if nothing had happened. What right do you have to freeze? Zadie growled, his face full of anger. The explosion that had already dissipated appeared once again in an extremely strange manner, as if time was flowing backward. Since you want to explode, then explode. Chong Tian snorted when he saw this. Immediately, the space around Zadie exploded, forming a huge black hole that wildly devoured everything around it. Zadie stood in the center of the black hole, but he was not affected by it at all. He stared at Chong Tian and said in a deep voice, Now, you've completely infuriated me. I'll show you my true strength. Chong Tian was unmoved when he heard Zadie's words. In the previous battle, Zadie had even displayed his divine force. How could he still hide his true strength? While Chong Tian was thinking about this, Zadie had already made a new move, Calamity's Descent. Following Zadie's bellow, Chong Tian immediately felt as if an extremely evil force had erupted in his body. It corroded his body without any warning, causing the divine force that was circulating freely in his body to show signs of stagnation. Witchcraft. Almost instantly, Chong Tian understood everything. He had always thought that Zadie was a rank 1 warrior. He had never expected Zadie to be a rank 1 magus. This was the first time he had seen a rank 1 magus with such a powerful physical body. In the previous battle, the wrong information that Chong Tian had gathered had caused him to be completely unguarded against witchcraft. As a result, Zadie's attack had succeeded, instantly reducing Chong Tian's combat strength by more than 30%. A 30% reduction in combat strength had a huge impact on the battle. While Firmament was using the divine power within his body to defend against the spell that had suddenly erupted, Zetter continued with a spurt of energy and cast another spell. Zephyr took out a mysterious yellow talisman. The purple talisman was engraved with some sinister and complicated gray words. Just one look at it was enough to make one feel extremely evil. Connect to the 9 underworlds, the evil spirits appear. As Zetter's voice fell, the purple talisman spontaneously combusted, turning into a pitch-black door filled with an evil aura in the void. The moment the door appeared, a series of hair-raising wails rang out. Then, raging resentment seeped out from the gaps in the door, turning into numerous ghostly faces that bared their fangs and brandished their claws. Qinchuan and Huiqiu were shocked when they saw this scene. Zendir actually had the ability to communicate with the netherworld. All along, the Nine Nether had been a place that existed only in legend. No one had ever verified whether the Nine Nether truly existed. But now, Zendir had actually connected to the Nine Nether and summoned an evil spirit. Is this really the Nine Nether? Huiqiu found it hard to believe. In the past, she had always thought that the Nine Nether was merely an ancient legend, and that the Nine Nether did not really exist in the universe. However, from the current situation, the Nine Nether was clearly real. It was just that they had never come into contact with the Nine Nether. I don't know whether this is real or not. This is the first time I've seen something like this. However, from Zetter's confident expression, there's a high probability that this is real. The Nine Nether really exists. Qinchuan looked at Zetter in shock. A rank 1 Magus actually had the ability to connect to the Nine Nether. This was too shocking. While Qinchuan and Huiqiu were still in shock over the matter of the Nine Nether, Zetter had already slowly walked to the front of the door and reached out to grab the door knocker. Zetter looked at the sky, his expression extremely excited, as if something exciting was about to happen. Now, I'll let you witness the true power of a rank 1 Magus. The moment Zetter finished speaking, he suddenly pulled the door knocker forcefully and opened the tightly shut door. The moment the door opened, the ghostly wails and howls of wolves became extremely clear and loud. Countless evil spirits surged out from the open door. Each of these evil spirits had an extremely powerful aura. Even the weakest one seemed to be at the peak of the combination stage. Under Zetter's command, they pounced straight at the sky. Faced with the tens of thousands of evil spirits pouncing on him in an instant, the sky, which was currently being troubled by witchcraft, had no choice but to take out a sacred weapon to block the evil spirit's attack. However, when the defensive sacred weapon was in front of the evil spirits actually crashed into the sacred weapon and devoured it completely in the blink of an eye. Qinchuan couldn't help but reveal a wisp of shock when he saw this. A high-grade defensive sacred artifact hadn't even been able to endure for a second under the attacks of these evil spirits before it was obliterated. Even the sky had not expected such a thing to happen. The moment the sacred weapon was destroyed, the sky immediately tried to save it. However, these evil spirits had already rushed over without a care and directly surrounded the sky. These evil spirits are so terrifying! Huiqiu could not help but exclaim. This was the first time she had seen such a terrifying scene. The dignified sky, a supreme existence, was actually being entangled by a group of evil spirits. Moreover, there were still evil spirits constantly rushing out from the door and pouncing towards the sky. Now, the sky was completely submerged in the tide of evil spirits. Qinchuan and Huiqiu could no longer see the sky's existence. They could no longer even sense the sky's aura. In their senses, evil auras were everywhere, and evil spirits were wreaking havoc. Zetter stood by the door and looked at the endless tide of evil spirits in front of him. He could not help but reveal a smug look on his face. If it was possible, he really wanted to see the expression on the sky's face. It must be shocked and angry, but there was nothing he could do. Ha ha! I've said it before. Everyone who looks down on me will have to pay a painful price. Even if you're the sky, a supreme existence, there's no exception. Zetter laughed wildly and unscrupulously. Just as Zetter was laughing, a pale white light suddenly lit up in the midst of the endless tide of evil spirits. Soon after, this pale white light filled this part of the universe. Wherever it passed, evil spirits turned into ashes. Chapter 1399. A stalwart figure stood in the center of the white light. His face was solemn and his expression was dignified. His palms were clasped together, and he was focused and devout. This figure was Chang Tian, who had been attacked by the evil spirit tide. However, now that the evil spirit tide had been defeated, no matter how many evil spirits there were, they could not get close to Chang Tian. The moment they came into contact with the pale white light, they were turned into ashes. Heaven is virtuous. Evil spirits wreak havoc in the human world. They must be destroyed. Heaven stared coldly at Zendil. He was furious at Zendil for releasing the evil spirit. Facing the angry heaven, Zendil gritted his teeth and said, "You can actually destroy my evil spirit gate? Even the natural disaster has no effect?" Zendil had expected heaven to have a backup plan, but he did not expect his two trump cards to be destroyed by heaven in an instant. At this moment, the evil spirit gate had already collapsed under the illumination of the pale white light. After the evil spirit gate disappeared, the pale white light also dissipated. The sky returned to its original state, looking ordinary and unremarkable. At this moment, Qin Chuan even felt that the heaven he saw earlier was the real heaven, and the current heaven was just an illusion. What technique did heaven use just now? Greichu was a little puzzled. Could it be the power of oath? All along, the power of oath had been under heaven's control. It had always been mysterious, and very few people had seen it. Therefore, Greichu could only suspect that the power just now was the power of oath, but he could not be sure if it was the power of oath. "I'm not sure what kind of power it is either, because I've never seen the power of oath before." Qin Chuan could not answer Greichu's question. He even wanted to ask Greichu what kind of power it was. "You deserve to die." Just as Qin Chuan and Greichu were conversing, the furious Zendil had once again launched an attack on heaven. Speaking of which, this was the first time Qin Chuan and Greichu had seen someone like Zendil. Other people would try their best to maintain their rationality in battle, calmly thinking about how to take each step and how to break the opponent's move. However, Zendil would fly into a rage at the slightest provocation. He was so unreasonable that he did not seem like a sorcerer, but more like a warrior. At this moment, just by looking at the situation, those who did not know would think that Zendil was a barbarian who had long been exterminated. When he fought, he relied on brute force and never used his brain. However, such a person was so powerful that he could easily crush Qinchu. And Qinchu. Divine power of the void. Zendil be heaven, earth, heaven. Streaks of void energy surged from all directions, turning this part of the universe into a deep purple color. The pressure was extremely terrifying. Under this terrifying power, Qin Chuan and Hui Qian could only tremble in fear. When heaven saw Zendil's actions, his expression turned cold. He said in a low voice, "Divine power of the vow." Following heaven's low roar, a touch of white suddenly appeared in the dark purple between heaven and earth. In the blink of an eye, this pale white color began to expand fiercely. In the blink of an eye, it occupied half of the space between heaven and earth. When the dark purple and pale white intertwined between heaven and earth, devouring each other, everyone in the celestial cluster raised their heads to look at the sky in shock. The originally clear sky had now turned dark purple and pale white. Under the sky where the two colors intertwined, everyone's faces were filled with horror. It was as if they were facing the end of the world. If there was anyone in the celestial cluster who could feel the power of the gods the most, it would definitely be Qin Chuan and Greichu. This was because the two gods who were fighting were right next to them. They could feel how small they were in front of the power of the gods up close. "These two are going all out," Greichu said to Qin Chuan in a trembling voice. "Now, the entire celestial cluster is affected by their power. Maybe after tomorrow, there will be no celestial cluster." Qin Chuan was shocked when he heard Greichu's words. He said, The entire celestial cluster is going to be destroyed? Is it that exaggerated? Greichu took a deep look at Qinchuan and said, otherwise, why do you think the ultimate existences rarely take action? Once the ultimate existences really fight, the damage to the universe will be too great. Qinchuan looked at the sky in the distance, then looked at Zendil and heaven. He asked, so these two are not going to care about the life and death of Heaven's star? No, Zendil doesn't care, and Heaven is trying his best to restrain Zendil. Greichu said to Qinchuan, with Zendil's strength, if he really doesn't care, he can completely turn the celestial cluster into ruins. As the ultimate existence of the Tian people and the actual ruler of the celestial cluster, Heaven will definitely not ignore the celestial cluster. Qinchuan asked after hearing Greichu's explanation, so, Heaven is now fighting against Zendil in order to protect Heaven's star. If he can suppress Zendil, then the celestial cluster will be fine. If he can't suppress Zendil, then the celestial cluster will suffer, right? Greichu nodded and said, yes, that's right. From the current situation, the two of them are now evenly matched. Qinchuan asked again, if I want to help Heaven, what should I do? Greichu turned his head and looked at Qinchuan as if he was looking at a lunatic. He asked, with your strength, how do you think you can help in a battle of this level? Qinchuan pondered for a moment, then asked, what if I can reduce Zendil's divine void power? Perhaps it won't decrease by much. Greichu looked at Qinchuan with some astonishment and asked, do you really have such a way? Qinchuan grinned and said, I'm now bound. Even if I have a way, I can't use it. But I don't have a way, but he does. As soon as Qinchuan finished speaking, a round golden ball of meat crawled out of his body. It was the little armored dragon. The little armored dragon looked at the dark purple and pale white sky and could not help but drool. Obviously, it was very eager to eat. When the little armored dragon appeared, Greichu was very surprised and said, King of Sacred Armors? Is this your King of Sacred Armors? The fact that Qinchuan had a King of Sacred Armors was not a secret in Zerd. Although Greichu had heard many legends about the little armored dragon, she did not take it to heart. Now that she saw the little armored dragon, she realized that Qinchuan's King of Sacred Armors was completely different from other people's Kings of Sacred Armors. In terms of size, the little armored dragon was enough to defeat a dozen other Kings of Sacred Armors. Chapter 1400. Are you sure he can really do it? Greycastle glanced at Qinchuan with some hesitation. The little armored dragon did not have any other special features other than its large size. Qinchuan did not know whether the little armored dragon could do it or not, but when the divine power of Heaven and Zendir began to intertwine, the little armored dragon suddenly reacted. It seemed to be very eager to devour divine power. That was why Qinchuan asked Greycastle the previous question. I don't know whether he is reliable or not, but I think there should be no problem. Qinchuan glanced at the little armored dragon and said to it, You can devour divine power, but only the dark purple ones. Do you understand? The little armored dragon nodded excitedly. If not for Qinchuan stopping it, it would have already rushed up. Seeing the little armored dragon nod, Qinchuan said to it, Then go. Remember to be careful. Don't be discovered. Without waiting for Qinchuan to finish his warning, the little armored dragon flew out impatiently and pounced towards the dark purple divine power between heaven and earth. Greycastle swallowed her saliva when she saw this. She suddenly had a premonition that perhaps Qinchuan and the little armored dragon would create a shocking miracle. Under the expectant gazes of Qinchuan and Huiqian, the little armored dragon was like a brave warrior as it charged towards the void godly power that filled the sky. It opened its little mouth to the limit, and with a roar, it viciously bit down on the void godly power. A small gap appeared where the little armored dragon had bitten. This small gap was like a dot of ink on a piece of white paper. Although it did not occupy a large area, It was extremely eye-catching. He can really do it. Qin Chuan was pleasantly surprised when he saw this. Hui Qi was dumbfounded. She didn't expect the little armored dragon to have such an ability. She couldn't help but think of her own sacred armor king. When she wanted her sacred armor king to come out and take a bite of the void godly power, she found that her sacred armor king was trembling. No matter what she said, it wouldn't come out. It was so scared that it wanted to die. This made Greycastle realize that not all king of sacred armor could be as crazy as the little armored dragon. She really wanted to ask Qin Chuan how he managed to cultivate such a brand new species like the little armored dragon. But obviously, now was not the time to talk about this, because the little armored dragon had already started to madly devour the divine power of the void. She really wanted to see to what extent the little armored dragon could reach. Although the divine power released by Zadir was almost endless and there was a large amount of divine power constantly replenishing the battlefield, as the saying goes, an ant's nest can destroy a dike of 1,000 miles. What the little armored dragon was doing now was digging an ant's nest. Time passed by minute by minute. After the little armored dragon had devoured a large amount of divine power, the speed of its devouring gradually slowed down. Moreover, some strange changes were happening to the little armored dragon's body. The little armored dragon's body, which was originally shining with golden light, was now slowly covered with extremely evil purple patterns. These purple patterns were faintly discernible, but the little armored dragon did not seem to be aware of them. I feel that your king of sacred armor should have a problem. You can't let it continue devouring. Greycastle reminded Qin Chuan. Divine power of the void is not something ordinary. Devouring too much of it has its benefits, but there are also disadvantages. What Greycastle could discover, Qin Chuan could naturally discover as well. However, he had already communicated with the little armored dragon in his mind, but the little armored dragon had no intention of responding to him at all. It also had no intention of stopping its devouring. In other words, the little armored dragon was now addicted to the process of devouring the divine power of the void and had already lost control. Greycastle saw the ugly expression on Qin Chuan's face and guessed that the little armored dragon had already lost control. She turned her head and looked at the purple patterns on the little armored dragon's body that were becoming more and more obvious. She said to Qin Chuan, "It looks like it's about to explode." "I know," Qin Chuan growled. Of course, he could see that the little armored dragon's devouring had reached its limit and could no longer eat. However, if he had a way to stop the little armored dragon, he would have done so long ago. There was no need to wait until now. Just as Qin Chuan and Greycastle were getting anxious because of the little armored dragon, Zaidi, who had been focusing all his attention on heaven, finally noticed that something was wrong. The little armored dragon's tiny figure that was madly devouring the divine power of the void attracted Zaidi's attention. "I was wondering why I kept feeling that something was not right. For some reason, that old fellow Heaven had the upper hand. So it's because of you, you stinking bug." Zaidi was furious as he watched the little armored dragon devouring the divine power of the void. He had always felt that something was very strange. Every time he released the divine power of the void, a small part of it would disappear. Now that he had discovered the little armored dragon, he finally knew where the problem was. "Humph!" Zaidi snorted coldly and flicked his finger at the little armored dragon from afar. Immediately, the little armored dragon's body flew out with a bang. It's still alive." When Zaidi saw that the little armored dragon's body did not explode, he could not help but be surprised. With his strength just now, it was enough to kill an ultimate existence in the tribulation stage. However, he could not hurt the little armored dragon at all. This was too strange. Just as Zaidi wanted to study the little armored dragon properly, Heaven took advantage of Zaidi's distraction to launch an attack on him. He took the opportunity to increase his advantage, and forced Zadie to temporarily give up on finding trouble with the little armored dragon and focus on dealing with heaven. At this moment, the little armored dragon's mind finally cleared after being beaten up by Zadie. It had a bitter look on its face as it raised its chubby little hand and patted its round belly. Then, it opened its mouth and spat out a large amount of divine power of the void. However, the divine power of the void dissipated after being spat out by the little armored dragon and did not return to Zadie's control. On the other side, Qinchuan and Huichou heaved a long sigh of relief when they saw this scene. Fortunately, Zadie discovered the little armored dragon at the crucial moment and interrupted the little armored dragon's devouring of the divine power of the void. Otherwise, the little armored dragon would have really exploded and died. "Little armored dragon, come back quickly!" Qinchuan called out to the little armored dragon with his mind. This time, the little armored dragon finally responded to Qinchuan and quickly returned to Qinchuan's side. The little armored dragon looked at Qinchuan with an aggrieved expression and said to Qinchuan, "I ate until I'm full." Qinchuan grinned and asked the little armored dragon, "How do you feel now?" The little armored dragon thought for a while, and suddenly revealed a big smile on its face. It said to Qinchuan, "I feel very good." Chapter 1401. It felt great? Qinchuan was a little surprised when he heard the little armored dragon's answer. It almost exploded just now. How could it feel great? Grissom was also very surprised. It was the first time she had seen the king of sacred armors that could talk. She could not help but wonder if the little armored dragon was really the king of sacred armors. How did it feel great? Qinchuan was very curious. Could it be that the little armored dragon had undergone a new mutation? Faced with Qinchuan's curiosity, the little armored dragon ate its fingers and thought for a long time, but could not figure out how it felt great. Anyway, it just felt great. When Qinchuan saw that the little armored dragon could not come up with an explanation for the time being, he decided to stop paying attention to the little armored dragon. Instead, he turned his attention to the battle between Heaven and Zadie. With the little armored dragon's help, Heaven managed to establish a slight advantage. Although it was not a huge advantage, its influence on the overall situation of the battle could not be ignored. At this moment, Zadie was attacking Heaven with all his might in an attempt to seize the advantage. However, it was a very difficult thing to do. Qinchuan looked at the battle in front of him and asked Grissom, "Are the two of them going to be in a stalemate like this?" Grissom shook his head gently and said, "This is also the first time I've seen a battle between two ultimate existences. I don't know much about it." Hearing Grissom's words, Qinchuan asked curiously, "Is the battle between the two of them really that dangerous?" "To be honest, on the surface I really don't feel much about it." Although the aura and pressure displayed by the battle between Heaven and Zadie were extremely shocking and powerful, Qinchuan had never seen before, he really could not tell what the danger was just by looking at the divine power of void and divine power of oath intertwining and devouring each other. Perhaps he was too ignorant. Hearing Qinchuan's question, Grissom looked at Qinchuan with a subtle gaze and said, "No wonder you had the guts to fight with Zadie just now. It turns out that you really don't know anything." Qinchuan said humbly to Grissom, "Please enlighten me." Grissom turned his head and looked into the distance. He asked Qinchuan, "What do you see at the limit of your vision?" Qinchuan subconsciously looked into the distance. After a while, he answered, "It's a mix of dark purple and pale white." Grissom nodded and said, "Where you can see, it's a mix of dark purple and pale white. Where you can't see, it's still a mix of dark purple and pale white." It's not an exaggeration to say that no matter where you stand in the celestial cluster, all you can see is a mix of dark purple and pale white. The battle between Heaven and Zadie affects the entire celestial cluster. It's where we can't see, and where we are insignificant. Hearing Grissom's words, shock immediately appeared on Qinchuan's face. Without waiting for him to speak, Grissom continued, I didn't make myself clear earlier. I said that the battle between Heaven and Zadie might destroy the celestial cluster, and that the celestial cluster would cease to exist tomorrow. In your understanding, it might be that after Zadie defeated Heaven, he would spend some time to conquer the entire celestial cluster. But what I said only happened in an instant. Grissom took a deep look at Qin and said, simply put, if Zadie has the upper hand, the celestial cluster will be destroyed in an instant. Whether it's you, me, your rescued friends, or even Stansos and the city of Starting Point, we will all be destroyed at the same time. When he heard Hui Qian's extremely detailed explanation, Qin couldn't help but open his eyes wide, and a wisp of shock appeared on his face. He'd originally thought that disappearing the entire Heaven star cluster in a single day was already exaggerated enough, but in reality, it only took an instant. In other words, we don't even have a chance to escape? Qin was really shocked. He always thought that even if he died, as long as Chen Chongqing and Lu Zi were still alive, there would still be hope for the humans and demons in the city of Starting Point. At worst, they could just retreat back to the land of exile. Before Zadie made his move, everyone would still have a chance to escape. But now, it seemed that he had thought too much and underestimated the existence of ultimate existences. The power of ultimate existences had really exceeded the limits of Qin imagination. No, I can't let Zadie win. Originally, Qin did not particularly care about the outcome of the battle between Zadie and Heaven. He thought that even if Zadie won, he would be the only one to die. However, if Zadie won, the celestial cluster would be completely destroyed in an instant. Then, he would have to find a way to stop Zadie from winning. What other ways do you have to stop Zadie? Grissom looked at Qin, her eyes full of curiosity. To be honest, Qin's endless tricks did not look like a demigod. She really could not imagine how powerful Qin would be if he became an ultimate existence. Perhaps he would be like you during the Lost Era, becoming the strongest person in the era. Qin did not know what else he could do, but he had to do something. When he looked at Little Armored Dragon again, Little Armored Dragon, who had eaten its fill, had already begun to doze off and was about to fall asleep. Little Armored Dragon, can you still devour some more void divine power? Qin looked at Little Armored Dragon expectantly. Now, Little Armored Dragon was the only one he could rely on. Hearing Qin's words, Little Armored Dragon raised its eyelids slightly and looked at Qin, then said, I'm full, Sleepy. Qin heard it and said helplessly, but if you can't devour more void divine power, we might all die. As he said that, Qin looked at the place where the void divine power and the void divine power intertwined. It seemed that Zadie had already regained some of his advantages. Will we die? Although Little Armored Dragon was not afraid of anything, it was still very resistant to things like death. It bit its finger and thought for a while, then said to Qin, I can control it. Qin was stunned. Control it? Control who? Little Armored Dragon glanced at the void divine power that pervaded its surroundings, and then gently pulled with its chubby little hand. A small amount of void divine power was pulled over, and it turned into a small ball of light in its hand. At the same time, dark purple patterns once again appeared on Little Armored Dragon's body. Seeing this scene, Qin and Huizhong both stared with wide eyes. There was actually such a thing? How much can you control? Qin swallowed a mouthful of saliva and asked curiously. He felt that his heart was about to jump out of his throat. Hearing Qin's question, Little Armored Dragon simply spread its 5 chubby fingers to the extreme, then fiercely tore off a large piece of void divine power. Just this much. Chapter 1402. Qin and Hui Chong watched as the Little Armored Dragon continuously kneaded and compressed a large ball of void god energy. Then, it turned into a large ball of void god energy that it hugged in its arms. They were completely stunned. Since when did the little armored dragon, king of sacred armor, possess such an ability? Qin Chuan glanced at the dark purple stripes on the little armored dragon's body and asked curiously, "Is it this unique pattern that granted you this ability?" The little armored dragon thought for a moment, then shook its head and said, "I don't know. This little thing, is it really the king of sacred armor?" Huicho hesitated for a long time, then finally asked Qin Chuan his question. The little armored dragon was really too powerful. Qin Chuan grinned when he heard this. Just as he was about to speak, Zadir suddenly roared from afar. "It's you again! It's you again, you stinking bug!" Zadie was unable to restrain his anger. He glared at the little armored dragon and the ball of void divine power in its arms. He really hated the little armored dragon. Hearing Zadie's angry scolding, Heaven also turned his gaze to the little armored dragon and focused on the ball of void divine power in the little armored dragon's arms. The expression on his face was very subtle. Previously, he was able to gain the upper hand because of the little armored dragon's help. Now that the little armored dragon had helped him gain an even greater advantage, he was naturally more happy. Seeing that Zadie was going to target the little armored dragon again, Heaven immediately increased the intensity of his attacks, forcing Zadie to devote himself to defense and temporarily have no time to take care of the little armored dragon. Qin Chuan saw that Zadie was forced by Heaven to the point that he had no way to take care of the little armored dragon. He could not help but let out a long sigh of relief and said to the little armored dragon, "Well done." The little armored dragon heard Qin Chuan's praise and smiled foolishly. Then, it pointed at the ball of void divine power in its arms and asked, "What about it?" Qin Chuan glanced at the ball of void divine power and asked, "Can you disperse it?" The little armored dragon shook its head. If it dispersed the ball of void divine power, it would return to Zadie's control. Although the little armored dragon could cut off the connection between the ball of void divine power and Zadie by swallowing it, it really could not swallow it now. Qin Chuan saw the little armored dragon shaking its head and asked again, "Then can you keep holding it like this without letting go?" The little armored dragon replied, "Only for a little while." Qin Chuan heard this and glanced at Heaven, who was gradually gaining the upper hand and stabilizing the situation. He said to the little armored dragon, "A little while is enough." As long as Heaven could maintain its advantage, it would not affect the overall situation even if they released the void god power back to where it came from. At this moment, it was already impossible for Zadir to turn the situation around. If this stalemate continued, he might have to pay a huge price to retreat. Thinking of this, although Zadie was filled with hatred, he could only retreat temporarily for the sake of the overall situation. Whoosh! Zadie's figure flashed and appeared beside Qin Chuan. Just as he was about to reach out and grab Qin Chuan's arm to take Qin Chuan away, a pale white light suddenly approached from afar and arrived in front of him in the blink of an eye. If Zadie still wanted to capture Qin Chuan, he would definitely be hit by the divine power of oath. Left with no choice, Zadie could only give up on capturing Qin Chuan. However, as soon as he retreated, Heaven came to Qin Chuan's side and protected Qin Chuan. At the same time, it also removed the restriction on Qin Chuan's body. At this time, it would be difficult for Zadie to capture Qin Chuan again. "Damn old man!" Zadie gritted his teeth and said angrily, "I'll be back." Before he finished speaking, Zadie's figure had already disappeared. The next moment, the dark purple that filled the sky receded like the tide, and pale white light completely occupied the entire space. After confirming that Zadie had retreated, Heaven said to Qin Chuan, "All right, it's fine now. He's gone." Qin Chuan immediately said to Heaven, "Thank you for saving me, Senior." Heaven looked at Qin Chuan and smiled. "You don't have to thank me. You should thank yourself." Qin Chuan was stunned and asked in confusion, "Thank myself?" Heaven nodded gently and said, "Actually, when Zadie appeared in the celestial cluster, I had already noticed him. He destroyed Messy Rock Star too quickly, so I didn't have time to stop him. Later, when he came to attack Planet Iki and captured everyone on Planet Iki, if I attacked Zadie directly, the people on Planet Iki would definitely suffer heavy casualties. Therefore, I had been holding back until you returned and teleported Zadie away from Planet Iki. Only then did I have the chance to resolve the crisis on Planet Iki and rush over to save you. At this point, Heaven paused for a moment, then turned his gaze to the little armored dragon squatting on Qinchuan's shoulder. He said with some surprise, "In the end, it was also this little guy who helped me secure victory. Otherwise, the victor between Zadie and I would have been unknown." Hearing Heaven's words, the little armored dragon puffed out its chest proudly, then accidentally pushed out the big ball of void divine power. Seeing that the big ball of void divine power was about to explode, Heaven waved his hand and strangled this accident. "Senior, although what you said makes sense, I still have to thank you." In front of Heaven, Qinchuan acted like an obedient child and did not dare to claim credit. Heaven did not care about Qinchuan's insistence on thanking him. Compared to that, he cared more about the runic sword in Qinchuan's hand. Heaven lowered his head and glanced at the runic sword in Qinchuan's hand. He said, "This must be the famous god artifact runic sword from ancient times. However, it seems to have been severely injured and its spirituality has been greatly damaged." Now that the runic sword had been exposed, Qinchuan had no intention of hiding it. He nodded and said to Heaven, "This is indeed a runic sword, but it can't be considered a god artifact anymore." Heaven glanced at Qinchuan in a subtle manner and asked, "Back then, you searched everywhere for runes and absorbed their power to repair the runic sword, right? I've heard the Heavenly Emperor mention before that you were searching for divine runes. The key to repairing the runic sword must be the divine runes." Qinchuan nodded honestly. He said, "That's right. I'm searching for divine runes, but I've already made some progress." After this incident, Qinchuan prepared to return to the land of exile and go to the unfettered secret realm to see if he could find the incomplete divine runes again. Heaven nodded gently, then took out a white stone and handed it to Qinchuan. He said, "Take this. If Zadie appears near you again, this stone will warn you." Qinchuan was overjoyed when he heard this and immediately took the stone. "Thank you, Senior." Chapter 1403. After the deep purple and pale white between heaven and earth receded, everyone in the heaven star cluster felt a sense of relief. Everyone had a relieved expression on their faces. What happened just now? Chen Chongqing's face was pale and covered in cold sweat. As a Dongshu stage cultivator, he felt that he was only one step away from death. Lu Zi looked in the direction of Planet Iki with a grave expression and said in a low voice, "The situation just now should have something to do with Zadie. He should be fighting with another expert." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Chen Chongqing was very surprised and said, "Isn't the person who can fight with Zadie a paragon? Could it be Chang Tian?" "We can't rule out that possibility." Zhou Lin turned her gaze to Tian San and asked, "Can you determine if the expert fighting with Zadie is Chang Tian?" When everyone heard Zhou Lin's words, they all turned their heads to look at Tian San, waiting for his answer. Tian San nodded and said, "That expert that fought Styre was indeed Firmament. Moreover, it was Firmament who obtained victory in the end." Hearing Tian San's answer, everyone was pleasantly surprised. If Chang Tian won, didn't that mean that Zadie was defeated? If that was the case, Planet Iki should be safe now. Then Boss should be safe now, right? Chen Chongqing asked impatiently. Ever since they were teleported away from Planet Iki, he had been worried about Qinchuan all the time. Now that he heard that Chang Tian had defeated Zadie, he was naturally most concerned about Qinchuan's situation. Just as Chen Chongqing asked this question, Lu Zi's optical computer suddenly received a message. The sender was Qinchuan. Lu Zi took a look at the message and said excitedly to everyone, Qin Chuan is fine. He asked for my coordinates just now and is coming to find us." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Chen Chongqing immediately cheered like a child. Everyone's faces also showed joyful smiles. To them, Qin Chuan being fine was definitely the best thing. Everyone discussed what happened just now. Not long after, a space portal appeared beside Lu Zi and Qin Chuan's figure slowly walked out. He smiled and said to everyone, "Hello everyone, we meet again." Seeing Qin Chuan appear, Chen Chongqing was so excited that he wanted to hug Qin Chuan. However, someone was faster than him. Lu Zi was the first to jump into Qin Chuan's embrace. Beside Chen Chongqing, the enchanting and impulsive figure stopped, and a gloomy expression on her face. Qin Chuan gently hugged Lu Zi, then smiled and said to everyone, "I'm fine, you don't have to worry about me." At this time, Lu Zi, who buried her face in Qin Chuan's chest, raised her head and smiled shyly. Then she said to everyone, "I've confirmed that Qin Chuan is fine." Hearing Lu Zi's words, everyone laughed. No one would make fun of Lu Zi for this kind of thing. On the other hand, Chen Chongqing noticed what happened just now. But after being glared at, he decided to shut his mouth and not say anything. "Qin Chuan, what happened after you sent us away?" Tian-san was the one who was most concerned about this matter. After all, the appearance of heaven was a big matter. He had to ask clearly. Qin Chuan smiled and briefly told everyone what happened after they left. When Qin Chuan said that Zadie wanted to use the lives of everyone on Aichi planet to play a 10-minute game with him, everyone could not help but be on tenterhooks. Under that kind of situation, Qin Chuan must have been in a very difficult position. He did not want to play any games, but he had no choice but to play along. When everyone heard Qin Chuan say that he had hit Zadie in the last second of the 10 minutes, they were all shocked. Even though Qin Chuan had used the first 9 minutes and 59 seconds to lay the groundwork for this last second to hit Zadie, it was still Zadie they were talking about. He was a dignified rank 1 expert, an ultimate existence. It was already extremely rare for Qin Chuan to hit him once. They could not hope for more. After that, when everyone heard Qin Chuan say that Zadie had once again broken his promise, they were all furious. They all felt that someone like Zadie was not worthy of being called an ultimate existence. He was a disgrace among ultimate existences, a scum. After that, Qin Chuan teleported Zadie away from Aichi planet with the help of the formation plate to buy time for Heaven to rescue Aichi planet. After that, Heaven fought Zadie, and the celestial cluster was almost destroyed. Everything that happened was shocking. Such an experience was too legendary and too shocking. That's about it. Actually, I didn't do anything. I was just watching the battle. After Qin Chuan finished speaking, he could not help but sigh. Such an experience, such a thing, if he had not experienced it personally, he would not even dare to think about it. Qin Chuan, you don't have to belittle yourself. Everyone saw the effort you put in. If it weren't for you, everyone might not have been able to leave here alive. Huang Feng looked at Qin Chuan and said emotionally, "To be honest, I've never really admired anyone in my life. You're definitely the first person who I admire from the bottom of my heart." "Yes, Qin Chuan, you don't have to be humble. If you're so humble, we won't be able to live anymore." Thelon looked at Qin Chuan and laughed. Surviving a disaster always made people happy. Qin Chuan smiled and said to everyone, "I'm not being humble. You can't expect me to brag too much, right? That would be too embarrassing." "You also have times when you feel embarrassed?" Chen Chongqing pretended to be surprised and said, "Boss, you weren't like this in the past. If you had the chance to boast about yourself, you would definitely spare no effort." When Qin Chuan heard this, he glared at Chen Chongqing and said, "You're already so old, yet you talk too much." Everyone laughed when they heard that. They felt that the way Qin Chuan and Chen Chongqing scolded each other was very amusing. At this moment, on the other side of the universe, someone could not bring himself to laugh. "Damn it! Damn it! Damn it!" Zephyr was furious. He poured his power into the universe as if he was venting his anger, shattering space and destroying the black hole. Originally, he already had victory in his grasp and would soon be able to defeat Chang Tian. However, the appearance of the little armored dragon disrupted his rhythm time and time again, giving Chang Tian the opportunity to seize the upper hand, causing him to lose the entire game. He should not have tried to capture Qin Chuan. He should have killed the little armored dragon with one slap. Now that he had left the battlefield, the more Zephyr thought about it, the angrier he became. He wanted to take revenge on heaven, on Qin Chuan, and most importantly, on the little armored dragon. Zephyr immediately prepared to return to the Sage Monarch continent and contact the Saint Emperor. He wanted to join forces with the Saint Emperor to deal with heaven and regain the face he had lost. Chapter 1404. When everyone proposed to return to the capital of Starting Point, Qin Chuan did not follow them. Instead, he went to the Banished Land alone. He could not wait to return to the Banished Land and go to the unfettered secret territory to see if he could find other incomplete divine prose. After Qin Chuan left the team, he went straight to the Banished Land. Qin Chuan did not see anyone when he came back this time. With his current strength, he could already lock onto the existence of the unfettered secret territory in the Banished Land and enter it easily. The restriction effect of the unfettered secret territory on the realm had also lost its effect on Qin Chuan. After entering the unfettered secret territory, Qin Chuan took out the Rune sword and asked, "Rune sword, can you sense the existence of other incomplete divine prose?" The Rune sword responded after a moment of silence. In the east. After receiving the Rune sword's response, Qin Chuan immediately flew towards the east. After a while, the Rune sword left Qin Chuan's hand and fell down. Seeing this, Qin Chuan also fell down. At this time, they had already arrived at an unexplored area of the unfettered secret territory. It was a huge forest. In the deep forest, there were many birds and beasts. When Qin Chuan and the Rune sword landed, they scattered in all directions. The Rune sword ignored those fleeing birds and beasts and directly landed in front of a stone tablet that was half buried in the ground. This stone tablet had been buried here for many years. The words on it had long been weathered and could not be read clearly. Bang! The runic sword slashed at the stone tablet, shattering it. The moment the stone tablet shattered, a faint green smoke flew out from the stone tablet and attached itself to the runic sword. The green smoke that was originally lingering around the rune sword appeared at the same time. The two green smoke merged together and looked much stronger. When Qin Chuan saw this, he couldn't help but reveal a wisp of joy. He said to the runic sword, "Let's go and continue searching for the next incomplete divine text." Under the guidance of the rune sword, Qin Chuan found 6 more incomplete divine runes in the carefree secret realm. When the 6 incomplete divine runes merged with the previous incomplete divine runes, they turned into a blurry divine rune. Qin Chuan looked at the blurry holy text and asked the rune sword in confusion, "Why does this holy text look so blurry? And there doesn't seem to be anything special about it." The rune sword responded to Qin Chuan's question. The reason why the divine text looked blurry was because it was only half a line of divine text. It was still incomplete. After receiving the rune sword's response, Qin Chuan was stunned. He asked again, "Are there any more incomplete runes in the carefree secret realm?" The rune sword responded, "There were no more incomplete divine runes in the carefree secret realm. All of the incomplete divine runes that could be found in the carefree secret realm were already here. As for the land of exile outside the carefree secret realm, there were no more incomplete divine runes." After receiving the rune sword's response, Qin Chuan couldn't help but frown. If there was only half a line of divine text, it didn't seem to be of any use. Where should I go to find the other half of divine text? Qin Chuan was having a headache. He had thought that he would be able to collect the complete set of divine text this time. He didn't expect that there would only be half of it. It was no wonder that the rune sword hadn't told him about the divine text. Even if it had, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. Half a line of divine text. It's better than nothing. Qin Chuan comforted himself. Since there was no more divine text in the land of exile, it was time for him to return to the city of beginnings and make plans. Sage Monarch Continent. After returning to the Sage Monarch Continent, the first thing Zadier did was go to the Sage Palace at the peak of Sagely Mountain to find the Saint Emperor, who was currently meditating. The Saint Emperor looked at the ashen-faced Zadier and asked, "Why did you come back by yourself? Where's Huaisho?" Zadier snorted coldly. "I don't know where Huaisho is. Maybe he's dead, or maybe he's still alive." The Saint Emperor wasn't angry at all. After all, he knew that Huaisho was still alive. As soon as Huaisho had escaped, he had contacted the Saint Emperor and told him about what had happened in the Celestial Cluster. The Saint Emperor had asked Zadier this question because he wanted to use this opportunity to shut Zadier up. However, Zadier didn't fall for it. "Come with me. We're going to slaughter Azure Heaven," Zadier said domineeringly. He didn't even consider whether the Saint Emperor would agree to his request. The Saint Emperor looked at Zadier calmly. "I'm in existence on the same level as you. Aren't you looking down on me a little too much?" Zadier laughed coldly when he heard the Saint Emperor, and he said, "What? Do you think there's something wrong with the way I speak?" Without waiting for the Saint Emperor to reply, Zadier continued, "Then why don't I have you come back and have a good chat with you?" Zadier was indeed helpless against the Saint Emperor. However, this time, Zadier wasn't representing himself. He was representing you, who was standing behind him. Zadier didn't believe that the Saint Emperor would be able to remain so calm in front of you. However, Zadier was wrong. The Saint Emperor didn't fall for it either. "If you can come, I'd like to meet him. I'd like to see the glory of the most powerful person in the universe in the ancient times." When he heard the Saint Emperor's words and saw the calm expression on his face, Zadier's expression suddenly changed. "You're not afraid of you?" he asked in a gloomy voice. The Sage Emperor smiled and asked, "Would you be afraid of a person locked up in a cage?" Zadier stared deeply at the Saint Emperor. "How do you know about this?" he asked in a deep voice. He didn't expect the Saint Emperor to know that you couldn't leave the Void Empire. The Saint Emperor looked at Zadier with a subtle gaze. "I was just guessing at first. I wasn't too sure. However, your reaction made me realize that I was right." Zadier was furious when he heard the Saint Emperor's words. "Are you trying to trick me?" The Saint Emperor looked at Zadier's pale face and said indifferently, "You can interpret it that way. However, I won't admit it." Zadier gritted his teeth. "So, you're saying so much because you don't want to kill Chang Tian with me, right?" The Saint Emperor nodded. "You can ask me for help. Chang Tian can also ask Atheus for help. We still don't have much of a chance of winning in a one-on-one battle. Since that's the case, why make a wasted trip?" Zadier sneered. "Atheus is just a weapon spirit. If you're willing to awaken the Insect Queen, we'll have another helper. If you're not willing to awaken the Insect Queen, I can help you." Chapter 1405. When Qin Chuan returned to the capital of Starting Point, what he saw was a thriving and bustling city. The humans and demons who had left the land of exile had completely adapted to their new living environment. They got along harmoniously, worked, and cultivated. Their daily lives were no different from the other races in the universe. This made Qin Chuan feel very gratified. After Qin Chuan returned, he first looked for Long Xiao and asked her to arrange for people to return to the Center of Airs to receive those who wanted to come out. As for the method to break the seal of the land of exile, he would naturally teach Long Xiao. After chatting with Long Xiao, Qin Chuan did not rest. Instead, He went to Long Zhao's independent cultivation room and prepared to stay in the cultivation room for a while. In the past period of time, Qin Chuan had been busy with some things. It had been a long time since he stopped to cultivate properly. In terms of diligence, Qin Chuan should be the laziest among the demigods. Qin Chuan sat cross-legged in the cultivation room, lowered his head, and pondered over some of the things that had happened during this period of time. He summed up his experience and sorted out his gains and losses. It had been nearly half a year since the disbandment of the endless Allied forces. The actions of the Division of Justice did not achieve the results he wanted. Instead, they suffered heavy losses because of the appearance of Zadier. The one who had gained the most should be the little armored dragon. Along the way, the little armored dragon had devoured a lot of good things. From the demigod power of demigods to the divine power of ultimate existences, it had all been devoured by the little armored dragon at least once. Every time it devoured a stronger power, there would be some strange changes in the little armored dragon's body. For example, this time, the little armored dragon had gained the ability to control the divine power of the void. Although the amount of divine power that the little armored dragon could control was limited and only a small part of it, it was still amazing enough. Thinking of this, Qin Chuan summoned the little armored dragon. Looking at the sleepy little armored dragon, Qin Chuan asked it, "Can your ability to control the divine power of the void become stronger?" Upon hearing Qin Chuan's question, the little armored dragon pondered for a moment before replying, "I need to eat more." Upon hearing little armored dragon's reply, Qin Chuan understood what little armored dragon meant. If little armored dragon wanted to control more void divine power, it would need to devour more void divine power. However, only Zadier possessed void divine power. It would not be easy for the little armored dragon to find another opportunity to devour void divine power. Other than void godly power, can you devour other godly powers? Qin Chuan asked curiously, "Are you able to control whatever divine power you have devoured?" The little armored dragon thought for a moment, then shook its head and said, "I don't know." Little armored dragon didn't know if it could do something that hadn't been tested before. Upon hearing little armored dragon's answer, Qin Chuan smiled and said, "It seems like I'm making things difficult for you. However, I believe that it won't be long before I can help you with your next experiment." After sending little armored dragon back into the brain to continue sleeping, Qin Chuan prepared to start cultivating. This time, Qin Chuan wanted to systematically cultivate the thunder-devouring technique. At this point in time, if one were to ask which law domain Qin Chuan could control the most power and had the best chance of becoming an ultimate existence, it would definitely be the thunder domain. As the strongest demigod in the thunder domain, Rengar's fall caused most of the power of law in the thunder domain to be in an ownerless state. Anyone who had comprehended the law of thunder could attempt to control this ownerless power of law. Not long ago, Qin Chuan had once controlled a small portion of the ownerless power of law. Hence, he was promoted to a demigod in the thunder domain. Now, Qin Chuan needed to calm down and work hard to control more of the ownerless power of law in the thunder domain. If there wasn't any, then he would steal it. Since the thunder-devouring technique was called thunder-devouring, how could it grow without devouring lightning? Holy Cluster, Sage Monarch Continent, Sage Palace. In the gloomy palace, the Sage Emperor sat on a high platform. On the table in front of him was a white glove. The glove seemed to be made of some kind of special leather. It was seamless, and there were no signs of stitching. Moreover, the glove was very long, enough to cover the entire arm of an ordinary person. The Sage Emperor looked at the glove in front of him, and fell into a long silence. Ever since the day he talked to Zadier, he had been in this position. It had been dozens of days since he moved. During this time, Zadier had come looking for him again. His words were very arrogant, and his attitude was very bad. "I'll only give you 3 days. If you can't make a decision by then, I'll do it myself." Zadier's words still echoed in the sage emperor's ears. He knew that Zadier wasn't joking. He really would do it. As for stopping Zadier, it wasn't as if he could stop Zadier just because he wanted to. After all, the white glove had flown to him on its own. Similarly, the glove could also fly to Zadier on its own. The sage emperor knew that although the insect queen's consciousness had yet to fully awaken, it wasn't completely unaware of the outside world. Right now, the insect queen was giving him a choice. Either he awakened the insect queen's consciousness on his own accord, or he let Zadier do it for him. If Zadier did it for him, then the divine artifact would belong to Zadier. With that in mind, the sage emperor finally made his decision. He picked up the white glove and slowly put his right arm into it. When the glove was completely on his right arm, something strange happened. Inside the white glove, where the outside world couldn't see, countless mouthparts suddenly grew out. These mouthparts were filled with fine, sharp teeth, and they viciously bit into the sage emperor's arm. The sturdy carapace on the sage emperor's arm was torn apart by these mouthparts in less than a second. Then, these mouthparts grew long and thin, and they ruthlessly pierced into the flesh of the sage emperor's arm. Gulp, gulp. These mouthparts wildly devoured the essence in the sage emperor's flesh. Their greed was like a bottomless pit, and they were completely insatiable. The sage emperor's expression was extremely calm in the face of these mouthparts' frenzied devouring. Clearly, he had already expected this to happen. This was also the reason why he had been unwilling to awaken the insect queen's consciousness for so long. This white glove was a divine artifact, but it also ate people. Chapter 1406. After 5 minutes of being devoured by the white glove, the Saint King's face was extremely pale. His aura was also extremely weak. In this state, the Saint King looked like he could not even stand up to a gust of wind. It was as though a demigod could easily defeat him. After devouring a large amount of the sage emperor's flesh and blood, the white glove had become sparkling and translucent. It was round and full and looked extremely beautiful. The sage emperor looked down at the white glove and pursed his lip. "You've eaten your fill. It's time to wake up." As the Saint Emperor's voice fell, a small protrusion slowly appeared on the surface of the white glove. This protrusion gradually took the shape of a white larva. This larva's lower body was fused into the white glove, while its upper body was covered in rings. Above its head was an extremely malevolent and evil red eyeball. Bai Xing, an extremely pleasant and even somewhat seductive voice, sounded from the white larva. However, the sage emperor called Bai Xing did not feel seductive at all. He only felt that it was eerie and terrifying. However, Shirahoshi did not show this emotion. On the surface, he still looked cold and calm. "You should be able to appear as a weapon spirit now. Why do you have to face me like this?" Bai Xing looked at the red eyeball and sighed. In the end, he still took this step and awakened the insect queen from her slumber. "How long has it been?" "It's been more than 4,000 years. You're finally willing to wake me up?" A figure suddenly appeared behind Bai Xing. Her skin was as white as snow, her figure was exquisite, and her appearance was even more beautiful. She placed her hands on Bai Xing's shoulders and moved her pink lips close to Bai Xing's ears, as she murmured in a low voice. It didn't seem like she was complaining about Bai Xing, but more like she was whispering sweet nothings. The insect queen's actions made Bai Xing involuntarily recall some things that had happened many years ago. It was delightful and memorable. However, at this moment, Bai Xing's heart was as still as water. He was unmoved. "If I had known that turning you into a divine weapon would lead to this, I would definitely have stopped you." Hearing Bai Xing's words, the insect queen giggled and said, "If I had known you were such a heartless man, and that you wouldn't wake me up even after 4,000 years, I wouldn't have let you onto my bed, and I wouldn't have helped you become a supreme being." The insectoid queen's words were extremely bold and shocking. If this were to spread, it would shock the entire holy cluster, or even the entire universe. Bai Xing fell silent in the face of the Insect Queen's words. Strictly speaking, he had indeed let the Insect Queen down. Seeing Shirahoshi remain silent, the Insect Queen continued to ask, "Why aren't you saying anything? Are you feeling guilty because you feel guilty?" Bai Xing sighed and said to the Insect Queen, "Do you think it's a good thing that we've become like this?" As he spoke, Bai Xing raised his right arm and glanced at the white glove that was tightly wrapped around his arm. At this moment, the white glove had taken root on his arm and could no longer be removed. If he tried to forcefully remove the white glove, then one of them would definitely die while the other would be injured. If he did not take off the white glove, as the two of them continued to fuse, their consciousness would uncontrollably fuse. By then, he would no longer be the Holy Emperor Bai Xing, and the Insect Queen would no longer be the Insect Queen. Their consciousness, including their personalities, would fuse into a new person. No one knew whether this new person would be a madman or a fool. Just thinking about it made Bai Xing shiver. Isn't it a good thing that we've become like this? This way we can stay together every day and feel each other's existence at all times. We'll never be separated. Compared to the negative things that Shirahoshi was thinking about, the Insect Queen was more concerned about the positive things. For example, how powerful would the combination of a supreme being and a divine weapon be? Or how they could stay together every day and never be separated again. These were the things that the Insect Queen cared about. As for the other things, she could temporarily ignore them, even if Bai Xing had woken her up after she had been asleep for 4,000 years. In the face of the Insect Queen's words, Bai Xing could only sigh and say nothing. "All right, don't sigh anymore." The Insect Queen gently stroked Bai Xing's forehead and whispered into his ear, "With me here, you don't have to worry about that you who might return at any time. He's no match for us now. You've underestimated him, and overestimated our combined strength. Bai Xing would never underestimate his opponents, especially you. Although you is terrifying, that's the you of ancient times. He had the runic sword and powerful allies. But what about him now? He's imprisoned in a place where there's no light at all. It's a question of when he'll be able to escape, let alone other things." The Insect Queen was aware of everything that had happened during this period of time. This was because her consciousness had been in a semi-conscious state for a very long time, allowing her to receive information from the outside world. However, the information had been stored at that time, and she was only able to decipher it after she had completely woken up. What if Qin Chuan dies? Bai Xing looked at the Insect Queen with a complicated expression. He did not wish for Qin Chuan to die, but Qin Chuan was just too much of a threat. Then don't kill Qin Chuan for now. Isn't that fine? The Insect Queen smiled. Now that I'm helping you, Xavier won't be able to threaten you. You don't understand. Bai Xing shook his head and said, "This matter isn't as simple as you think. With Xavier's strength, he could easily kill Qin Chuan even without Bai Xing's help. The reason why Xavier sought Bai Xing's help was to deal with heaven and atheists. This had nothing to do with Qin Chuan. Once Xavier calmed down and temporarily forgot the humiliation that heaven had brought him, Qin Chuan would once again face the threat of death. All right, let's not continue thinking about these things. Now that we're finally reunited, shouldn't we think and do some happy things?" As she spoke, the Insect Queen's body had already fallen into Bai Xing's arms. "I've already taken the initiative to do so much. Are you sure you want to continue being indifferent?" Bai Xing finally moved in response to the Insect Queen's words. He reached out and gently caressed the Insect Queen's smooth cheeks, then leaned over and kissed the Insect Queen's pink lips. Chapter 1407. Universe Calendar, Year 14. 63 million, February. This is the third month since Qin Chuan returned to the city of Starting Point. During this period, except for the reunion with everyone during the New Year, he spent the rest of his time in the cultivation room. In these 2 months, Qinchuan worked hard to cultivate the thunder-devouring art and achieved very good result. In the field of the law of thunder, he has controlled more than 70% of the power, and this is not the end. He continues to control more power. Ding dong. The doorbell of the cultivation room suddenly rang. Hearing the sound, Qinchuan stopped cultivating and opened his eyes to look at the monitoring system. When he saw that the person standing outside the cultivation room was Lu Zi, he controlled the access control system to open the door of the cultivation room. When the door of the cultivation room opened, Lu Zi walked in from the outside. She glanced at Qinchuan and asked, "How's your cultivation recently?" Qinchuan smiled and said, "It's not bad." After asking about Qinchuan's recent cultivation progress, Lu Zi said to Qinchuan, "I came to disturb your cultivation this time because heaven wants to see you." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Qinchuan was a little surprised and asked, "Heaven wants to see me?" Lu Zi nodded and said, "Our city of Starting Point has an interstellar transmission array that leads directly to Stansos. You can go there at any time. Heaven will wait for you in District 1. Qinchuan heard this and asked with some doubts, "Did heaven say why it wants to see me?" Lu Zi shook her head and said, "This matter was told to me by Sharmila. I only know that heaven wants to see you, I don't know the details." Qinchuan nodded and said, "In that case, I'll go there." After saying that, Qinchuan got up and walked outside with Lu Zi. On the way to activate the interstellar transmission array, Lu Zi hesitated for a moment and said to Qinchuan, "Don't put too much pressure on yourself. It's better to let nature take its course." Hearing Lu Zi's words, Qinchuan was stunned for a moment, then he asked with a smile, "You were concerned about my recent cultivation progress because you were worried that I was in a hurry to succeed?" Lu Zi nodded and said, "You have done enough, whether it's for everyone or for others, you have done your best. Everyone saw how hard you worked to cultivate and increase your strength. On one hand, they were worried that you might go berserk. On the other hand, everyone felt a bit ashamed. That's why they've been cultivating so diligently. However, it was also because of this that Huang Feng almost went berserk. Fortunately, he was discovered in time, so his foundation wasn't damaged." When Qinchuan heard this, he frowned slightly and said, "My cultivation is my own business. Why must everyone force me?" Lu Zi helplessly smiled and said, "I can understand you, but the others can't." Qinchuan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He asked, "Then what should I do?" Lu Zi had already thought of a countermeasure. She said to Qinchuan, "I suggest that you find something for everyone to do. For example, training the army. Make everyone busy. This way, everyone won't feel like they can't help you." Although they weren't able to help Qinchuan in battle, they could still help Qinchuan in other aspects. "I understand what you mean. How about this, you help me arrange something for everyone to do. Just say that it's my idea." Qinchuan helplessly smiled and said to Lu Zi, "That's the only thing we can do right now." Lu Zi nodded and said to Qinchuan, "I understand." When Qinchuan arrived at Stansos through the interstellar transmission formation and entered the first region, Thelon, who had been waiting for a long time, led Qinchuan to Heaven Emperor's residence. At this moment, Heaven Emperor was in Heaven Emperor's vegetable garden, planting vegetables with Heaven Emperor. When Qinchuan arrived, he saw Heaven Emperor and Heaven Emperor. Both of them were wearing hemp clothes and were covered in mud. They were barefooted as they planted vegetables in the garden. From the looks of it, they seemed to be enjoying themselves. They didn't find it boring at all. For us Tian people, cultivating the heart is more important than cultivation. Thelon smiled and said to Qinchuan, "I won't hide it from you. I've also opened up a small vegetable garden in my residence. I'm preparing to plant vegetables there. You can tell me what you like to eat. I'll plant some and I'll invite you to eat when I harvest them." Qinchuan laughed and said, My taste is very easy to satisfy, as long as it's vegetables. As the two of them talked, they approached the vegetable garden. Heaven Emperor and Heaven Emperor had already noticed their arrival. Heaven Emperor walked out of the vegetable garden and casually patted the mud off his hands. He then sat on the ground and said to Qin, come and sit. Qin walked to Heaven Emperor and sat down in front of him. He said, I heard that Senior was looking for me. What is it? Heaven Emperor looked at Qin and asked, how much power do you control in the law of Thunder Domain? How far are you from 90%? Hearing Heaven Emperor's words, Qin asked in surprise, Senior, how do you know that I control the law of Thunder Domain? Heaven Emperor smiled and explained to Qin, after witnessing the battle between me and Zendir, you must be very eager to obtain divine power. Among the various powers of laws that you control, only the law of Thunder Domain has the conditions to reach the pinnacle. As for the other powers of laws, I don't have to tell you. You know that it's very difficult. After hearing Heaven's explanation, Qin understood that it was because he had been cultivating in seclusion during this period of time that made Heaven realize his thoughts. Indeed, the heavens were right. Among the laws of lightning, the laws of space, and the laws of time that Qin currently controlled, only in the law of lightning could he advance to the pinnacle. However, with Yu's existence in the law of space and the law of time, it was basically impossible for him to reach the pinnacle with the help of those two powers of laws. Qin nodded honestly and said, that's right. I've been controlling the law of Thunder Domain recently. I hope that I can reach the pinnacle in the law of Thunder Domain. Right now, I'm about 20% away from reaching the threshold of the pinnacle. Controlling more than 90% of the power of laws in a single law of Thunder Domain was the minimum threshold for reaching the pinnacle. Qin currently controlled more than 70% of the power of laws in the law of Thunder Domain. He was very close to the threshold, but the closer he got, the more difficult it would be. Heaven Emperor smiled when he heard Qin's words. He asked, if I have a way to help you reach the pinnacle in the shortest amount of time, would you be willing? Chapter 1408. Hearing Heaven's words, Qin was a little surprised. Heaven actually had a way to help him become a supreme existence in the shortest time possible? Qin thought for a moment, then frowned slightly and asked, Senior, are you trying to use some special method to increase the unowned power in the law of Thunder Domain so that I can control it more easily? Heaven chuckled and said, the special method you're talking about, are you referring to coercion or assassination of other cultivators who control the law of thunder? Qin fell silent. That's right, that was what he was thinking. Because other than this method that could help him quickly control more of the law of thunder, he couldn't think of a better method. Seeing Qin fall silent, Heaven reached out and patted Qin's shoulder, leaving a black handprint. Then he said to Qin, we Tian people have always pursued the path of nature. We won't force ourselves to do things deliberately. Don't think of us as too dark. Hearing Heaven's words, Qin let out a sigh of relief in his heart. At the same time, he revealed an extremely ashamed expression and said to Heaven, sorry, my thoughts were too dirty. It's human nature, I can understand. Heaven smiled and didn't take it to heart. Seeing this, Qin immediately asked, Senior, what is the method you're talking about? Heaven stopped smiling and said with a serious tone, use the power of Oz to help you become a supreme existence. Hearing Heaven's answer, Qin was a little surprised and asked, the power of Oz? Song Tian nodded. You know about the power of Oz. This is the law domain I control. In the Heaven Star Cluster, there are countless people who make Oz to the Heaven Star Cluster every day, making promises or making guarantees. Some people fulfill their promises and guarantees, while others break their promises. In the end, they will not have a good ending. This time, Qin understood what the heavens meant. The heavens wanted him to make an oath and borrow the power of the oath to ascend to the pinnacle of existence. Senior, the power of oaths should be more of a binding ability, right? Qin Chuan was extremely curious. How exactly was this going to work? Hearing this, Chang Tian said to Qin Chuan, "It's actually very simple. You just have to swear that you must reach the pinnacle of the law of thunder within a certain period of time, and I can help you." Hearing Heaven's words, Qin Chuan was stunned. "It's that simple?" Chang Tian shook his head and said, "This matter isn't as simple as it seems on the surface. Firstly, you need to swear an oath. Only then can I borrow the power of the oath to help you. Secondly, I'm not the only one helping you this time. Atheus is also helping you." Qin Chuan was surprised and asked, "The only true God, Atheus?" Heaven nodded and told Qin Chuan, "Indeed, it is Atheus. He wields the power of prayers. With his abilities and my power of oath, it is more than enough to help you ascend to the peak of existence. However, there is one more thing. You will need to pay a certain price during the oath." Qin Chuan was a little confused and asked, "What price?" Heaven explained to Qin Chuan, "There is always a price for an oath. For example, if you don't take revenge, you are not human. This oath is the price for the oath." "So this is the price you are talking about?" Qin Chuan was enlightened and asked again, "Then what price should I pay?" Heaven took a deep look at Qin Chuan and said, "You need to think about what price you need to pay. Because this matter involves the existence of the pinnacle of existence, the greater the price you are willing to pay, the higher the success rate." Hearing Heaven's words, Qin Chuan couldn't help but fall silent. At this moment, Qin Chuan had too many things to think about. Seeing Qin Chuan fall silent, Heaven didn't disturb Qin Chuan. He just quietly looked at Qin Chuan and waited for Qin Chuan to respond. After about 5 minutes, Qin Chuan raised his head and looked at Heaven. He asked, "Senior, I have a few questions. First, why are you helping me? Why are you not helping the other Tian people?" Heaven wasn't surprised that Qin Chuan would ask this question. He explained to Qin Chuan, "Because only you have the highest chance of ascending to the pinnacle of existence in a short period of time. The others don't have this qualification. Even if we help them, they won't succeed." Qin Chuan believed Heaven's explanation. Because other than Heaven Emperor, who was a demigod, the other Tian people were all at the tribulation passing stage. They didn't have the potential to ascend to the pinnacle of existence. Heaven Emperor was the successor of Heaven. Before this generation of Heaven fell, Heaven Emperor naturally couldn't ascend to the pinnacle of existence. As for God Lord Apollo and Pope Saint Baudilo, they were both at the tribulation passing stage and had yet to become demigods. So after thinking about it, he was the most suitable person. Heaven looked at Qin Chuan and said, "Actually, your friends Lu Zi and Zhou Lin are also very good candidates. They have both become demigods and are well-known figures in their respective law domains. If you help them, they will have a high chance of ascending to the pinnacle of existence. But the problem is that you are the most suitable and the most powerful among all of them. Only helping you is worth it." Qin Chuan looked deeply at Heaven and said, "One last question. Can I completely trust you?" Hearing Qin Chuan's question, Heaven Emperor and Thelon's expressions changed slightly. Long before Heaven had the intention to help Qin Chuan, they had already expected that Qin Chuan would ask such a sharp question. If they raised it, it would inevitably hurt the relationship between the two sides. But if they didn't raise it, Qin Chuan would definitely feel uneasy. Perhaps it would cause his ascension to fail because of this. At that time, when faced with this question, Heaven said something very interesting. Heaven said that if Qin Chuan didn't raise this question, then Qin Chuan wouldn't have been able to reach his current height, let alone ascend to the pinnacle of existence. Even if Qin Chuan was lucky enough to ascend to the pinnacle of existence, he wouldn't be able to become stronger. This was because a person who had absolute trust in other people without any doubts would never become a powerhouse. Powerhouses needed true friends. But at the same time, powerhouses were lonely and couldn't completely trust others. Since ancient times, those who trusted others unconditionally wouldn't have a good ending. This was because people like that weren't very smart. Even Lu Zi, who had always trusted Qin Chuan, would sometimes raise her doubts. It was very difficult for Qin Chuan to completely trust Heaven. Heaven smiled. Hee hee, you can trust us. I can swear to myself. Chapter 1409. In the face of Heaven's joking guarantee, Qin Chuan decided to believe in Heaven after careful consideration. He could not think of any reason why Heaven would frame him. Senior, please help me. Qin Chuan stood up and bowed deeply to Heaven. His attitude was very sincere. Heaven stood up and said to Qin Chuan, "Then, you can make the oath now. But remember, it cannot be too short or too long. Around 3 months is more suitable." Qin Chuan nodded, then raised his right hand and swore, "I, Qin Chuan, hereby swear that I will definitely become an ultimate existence in the next 3 months. If I can't do it, then I will never become an ultimate existence in this lifetime." Heaven was silent for a moment when he heard Qin Chuan's words. Then, he asked Qin Chuan, "Your oath is now effective. I'll ask you one last time. Are you sure?" Qin Chuan nodded and said, "I'm sure." After Heaven received Qin Chuan's confirmation, he said to Qin Chuan, "The oath has been established. Now, it's time to move on to the second step of the plan." The second step of the plan was actually very simple. It was to let Qin Chuan start cultivating. To be more specific, it was to let Qin Chuan snatch more of the power of law in the domain of the law of thunder. When Qin Chuan sat down on the grassland and began cultivating the thunder-devouring art, he was very surprised to find that when he controlled the power of law, his speed was actually much faster than before. Just as Qin Chuan was feeling surprised, Heaven's voice suddenly rang in his ears. "If you find that your speed of controlling the power of law has increased when you cultivate, don't be surprised. That's the effect of the oath and wish power." Hearing Song Tian's words, Qin Chuan could not help but reveal a look of realization on his face. So this was what Song Tian meant by helping him. Increasing the speed of one's control over the power of laws was indeed a very simple and crude method of assistance. Qin Chuan speculated that if he continued to cultivate at his current speed, it would take him about 4 to 5 months to master the law of thunder, which was still a little slower than the time he had promised when he made the oath. Thinking of this, Qin Chuan couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. However, after thinking about it, he still decided to cultivate first. It wouldn't be too late to think about other things after the 3-month deadline. The land of the silver hoop. Lei Gu was one of the geniuses of the younger generation of the Lei family. He had reached the peak of the Dongshu realm when he was only 100 years old. As long as he could cross the threshold between the peak of the Dongshu realm and the peak of the Dongshu realm, he was confident that he could reach the form synthesis stage within 3 years and become the new overlord of the Lei family. It was also because of this that Lei Gu had always been extremely domineering in the Lei family. No matter what benefits there were, he would use his fists to seize them. Even if others had their benefits stolen by Lei Gu, they would only be angry but not dare to say anything. Today, it was time for the Lei family's logistics union to distribute cultivation resources. It was said that the logistics union would distribute a 4,000-year-old thunder herb today. It could greatly increase the speed of a cultivator's comprehension of the law of thunder. It could be said that it was a treasure that could only be found by chance. Lei Gu was determined to obtain this thunder herb. When Lei Gu arrived at the logistics union, there was already a long queue at the window where the cultivation resources were distributed. Lei Gu did not follow the rules like the others to the back of the queue. Instead, he walked straight to the front of the queue. Although the people in the queue were very angry when they saw this scene, they did not dare to say anything. "Manager, where is the thunder herb?" Legu walked to the window and directly asked the manager, who was distributing the cultivation resources, about the thunder herb with a cold expression. Hearing Legu's words, the manager smiled and said, "So it's young Master Legu. Are you also here for the thunder herb?" Legu frowned slightly and asked, "Is there someone else who is interested in the thunder herb?" The manager nodded and said helplessly, "You're right. 2 minutes before you came, young Master Leia took the thunder herb." Leia. When he heard this name, Legu's expression suddenly became gloomy. If there was anyone in the Lei family who could be compared to him in terms of talent, it would be Leia. In the past, Leia had always been Legu's competitor. No matter what, they would compete to see who was better. Now that both of them were at the peak of the Dongshu realm, their battle strength and comprehension of the law of thunder were about the same. If one of them could obtain the thunder herb and use its ability to speed up their comprehension of the law of thunder, they might be able to seize the opportunity to break through to the peak of the Dongshu realm and then advance to the form synthesis stage. Therefore, no matter what, he could not let Leia obtain the thunder herb. Thinking of this, Legu turned around and flew towards Leia's residence. When the crowd saw the direction Legu flew in, they all became excited. At this moment, anyone could see that Legu was going to find Leia to snatch the thunder herb. Go, go, go! Let's go watch the show and come back later to queue up. Let's go, let's go! The battle between Leia and Legu is going to be the most exciting. I bet 10 third-grade star stones that Legu will definitely win. The crowd followed Legu's departing figure and quickly chased after him. In front of them, Legu had already blocked Leia, who was leisurely returning to his residence. Leia looked at the menacing Legu. He didn't need to guess to know that Legu was here for the thunder herb. He chuckled and said to Legu, "Legu, you don't need to say anything. I know that you're here for the thunder herb. Unfortunately, I've already beat you to it. I can't let you have it." Legu was furious when he heard Leia's words. He said in a deep voice, "Cut the crap. Same old rules, a fair duel. The thunder herb will belong to whoever wins." Leia laughed and said to Legu, "Legu, in the past, when we had a fair duel, we were fighting for the treasures that had yet to be distributed. This time, the thunder herb is already in my hands. It already belongs to me. Why should I have a fair duel with you?" Leia walked in front of Legu as he spoke. He reached out his hand and patted Legu's shoulder lightly. He sneered and said, "I can't wait to see you grovel in front of me and call me Senior Leia. I'm really looking forward to it." Legu's face turned red when he heard Leia's words. He would rather die than let that happen. Leia was very satisfied when he saw the change in Legu's expression. He walked around Legu and continued forward. At this moment, Legu suddenly roared and launched a sneak attack on Leia. Die! Chapter 14:10. A month passed by in a flash. Qin Chuan had made great progress in the Thunder Law domain, while cultivating the thunder-devouring art in seclusion this time. The power he controlled had already reached 80%, and he only needed 10% more to reach the threshold of becoming a perfected existence. However, the progress would become slower and slower. Now, Qin Chuan's progress had slowed down. While Qin Chuan was cultivating, Heaven had been paying attention to some of the things that happened in the universe. Although the universe was huge and there were all kinds of things happening all the time, Heaven could clearly feel that there were more things related to the Thunder Law domain happening in the universe recently. For example, 2 geniuses of a certain family fought and one died while the other was injured. Another example was that a certain overlord of the Thunder Law domain accidentally died while exploring a ruin. Another example was that a certain overlord of the Thunder Law domain became a cripple because of cultivating in seclusion. There were too many things like this that had happened. Some things attracted the attention of more people, while some things were not known by many people. However, these things were no secret to Heaven because they were inseparable from him. The Sky Emperor sat beside Heaven and looked at him with a complicated gaze. He sighed and said, "Heaven, we once promised Qinchuan that we would not harm others to help him become a perfected existence." Heaven looked at the Sky Emperor calmly and said, "I have never harmed anyone. This is the effect of the power of oaths and wishes. It has nothing to do with us." The Sky Emperor smiled bitterly when he heard Heaven's response. If Qinchuan knew about this, what would he think? Heaven looked at the Sky Emperor's bitter smile and asked, "Do you think that if Qinchuan did not make an oath, these things would have happened?" Hearing Heaven's question, Heaven Emperor didn't know how to answer it. If these things were affected by the power of oaths and wishes, then they were definitely there. However, no one knew how big the influence was, or if they didn't have this influence, then these things wouldn't have happened. Seeing the Sky Emperor's silence, Heaven asked again, "Let me ask you again. If we did not participate, do you think Qinchuan could have become a perfected existence?" This time, the Sky Emperor did not remain silent. He replied, "With Qinchuan's talent and heaven-defying performance, he has a great chance of becoming a perfected existence." Speaking of this, the Sky Emperor sighed and said, "When Qinchuan first came to Stansos, he was just an unknown early-stage Dongshu cultivator. I didn't expect that in such a short time, he would have grown to such an astonishing level." Heaven nodded. "You see, even without our help, Qinchuan could have become a perfected existence. All we did was make Qinchuan's progress a bit faster." In other words, even without our influence, the people who got into trouble would still have gotten into trouble. Perhaps they would have used a different method, or perhaps they would have delayed it a bit. But what is meant to happen, will happen. The Sky Emperor did not know how to refute Heaven's explanation. It sounded like sophistry. Heaven understood the Sky Emperor, and could easily see through the Sky Emperor's thoughts. However, he did not explain further. There was no need to. Things had already come to this point, and there was no point in saying anything. Wait until Qinchuan comes out of seclusion. You can tell him about these things. After Tsang Tian said this to Sky Emperor, he got up and left. Sage Monarch Continent, Sage Palace. Zendir had once again come to the Sage Palace, but this time, he had lost all patience. "Sage Emperor, are you going to help me or not?" Zendir looked at the white glove on the Sage Emperor's arm, and a hint of fear flashed in his eyes. He might not have been afraid of the Sage Emperor in the past, but with the help of the Insect Queen, he was no match for the Sage Emperor. Therefore, even if he had lost all patience, the only thing he could do now was to interrogate Zendir. The Sage Emperor sat on the high platform and looked calmly at Zendir. He replied, "This is your own matter. Forgive me for not being able to help you." Hearing the Sage Emperor's answer, a cold smile appeared on Zendir's face. He said, "It seems that with the Insect Queen's help, you're really confident." As soon as Zendir finished speaking, the Insect Queen's figure slowly appeared in the Sage Emperor's arms. She leaned against the Sage Emperor's chest and looked askance at Zendir. She asked, "What, do you have a problem with that?" In the face of the Insect Queen's undisguised killing intent, Zendir's face could not help but turn ashen. He said in a deep voice, "Very well. Since you're not willing to help me, I'll go myself." With that, Zendir turned around and prepared to leave. "Wait a minute. Who said that we're not willing to help you?" At this moment, the Insect Queen suddenly spoke again, causing Zendir to stop in his tracks. Zendir turned around and looked at the Insect Queen suspiciously. He then looked at the Sage Emperor and asked, "You're willing to help me? Then why did you reject me just now?" Zendir was not the only one who was puzzled. The Sage Emperor was equally puzzled. He lowered his head and looked at the Insect Queen, wanting to know what she was thinking. The Insect Queen smiled and said to Zendir, The Sage Emperor and I combined our combat power can be said to be the #1 in the world. You want us to help you? Is that why you were so aggressive earlier? Hearing the Insect Queen's words, Zendir suppressed the anger in his heart and forced a smile on his face. He said, I was wrong just now. I'm really sorry. I apologize to you, Brother Sage Emperor. Seeing that the situation had taken a turn for the better, Zendir immediately became a different person. He apologized to the Sage Emperor with a smile, and even called him brother intimately. It was clear that Zendir was really a temperamental madman. No matter what he did, it would not be too surprising. The Insect Queen chuckled and turned to look at the Sage Emperor. She asked, Sage Emperor, have you forgiven his rude behavior now? Hearing the Insect Queen's words, the Sage Emperor remained silent and did not answer. Seeing this, the Insect Queen did not mind. She turned to Zendir again and said, We can help you, but we have a condition. Once we kill Chang Tian and Atheus, our sacred tribe will annex the Celestial Cluster. As for the Deus Cluster, we can leave it to your Void Empire. Hearing the Insect Queen's condition, Zendir laughed and said straightforwardly, I was wondering what kind of condition it was. As long as you're willing to help, once the matter is done, the Celestial Cluster will belong to you. P.S. Previously, a book friend raised a problem. The calculation of time in the universal calendar year 146X is wrong. This is a mistake I made when writing the book. I apologize to everyone here. The text will be changed to universal calendar year 146X. There is no 10,000. I apologize again. Chapter 14:11. After agreeing on a time to leave, Zendir left in satisfaction, leaving only the Saint Emperor and the Insect Queen in the hall. After a moment of silence, the Saint Emperor asked the Insect Queen, There's nothing to gain from joining forces with him. Who says there's nothing to gain? The Insect Queen chuckled and said, Zadie is Yu's lackey, and his only lackey now. If we get rid of Zadie, it's equivalent to cutting off Yu's control over the outside world. Isn't that a benefit? Hearing the Insect Queen's words, the Saint Emperor frowned slightly and asked in surprise, You plan to get rid of Zadie in the name of joining forces with him? Not us. We'll borrow the hands of Heaven and Atheus to get rid of Zadie. The Insect Queen smiled and said, Zadie wants to join forces with us to deal with Heaven and Atheus. When the time comes, we'll just have to do our part. I think Heaven and Atheus will definitely not let go of this great opportunity to get rid of Zadie. When the time comes, we'll just have to sit back and watch the show. Hearing the Insect Queen's explanation, the Saint Emperor finally understood what the Insect Queen meant. It turned out that the Insect Queen wanted to get rid of Zadie with a borrowed knife. Moreover, if the two of them joined forces, they would not have to fear Heaven and Atheus. Do you really think so? The Saint Emperor glanced at the Insect Queen and said, If Zadie finds out about our plan, or if he's lucky enough to escape, I'm afraid we'll be in some trouble. That fellow is a lunatic, and he's capable of doing anything. The Saint Emperor could not imagine how terrifying the destructive power of an absolute being who had no scruples could be. Don't worry, we won't let him escape. The Insect Queen looked at the Saint Emperor and smiled. If Heaven and Atheus are really useless and let Zadie escape, then we'll personally get rid of Zadie. The Saint Emperor frowned slightly when he heard that. He felt that there was a loophole in the Insect Queen's plan, but this was indeed a very good opportunity to get rid of Zadie. Some risks were still worth taking. If that's the case, then it's decided. The Saint Emperor was determined to get rid of Zadie no matter what and reduce Yu's power. Seeing the determination on the Saint Emperor's face, the Insect Queen's eyes could not help but become somewhat fiery. She said softly, Now that we're done talking about business, shouldn't we do some private things now? Hearing the Insect Queen's words, the Saint Emperor's expression became somewhat complicated. Celestial Cluster, Stanos. After more than a month of closed-door cultivation, Qinchuan walked out of the cultivation room. Although a month of closed-door cultivation was not long and even somewhat short, Qinchuan was very tired because controlling the power of the law domain was not an easy task. It consumed a lot of energy. Even though Qinchuan was now a demigod and his mental strength had reached the spirit condensation stage, he still felt that it was unbearable. When Qinchuan walked out of the cultivation room, someone conveyed the news that the celestial Dharch wanted to see him. When Qinchuan heard the news, he went straight to the celestial Thearcha's cottage and met him in the vegetable garden. When the celestial Dharch saw Qinchuan, he put down the tools in his hand and asked Qinchuan, "How's your harvest in the past month?" Qinchuan smiled and said, "This is all thanks to the help of Senior Tsang Tian and Senior Atheist. If not for their help, I'm afraid it would have been very difficult for me to obtain such a huge harvest in such a short time." Looking at the smile on Qinchuan's face, the celestial Dharch suddenly did not know how to tell Qinchuan about that matter. Seeing the celestial Thearcha's troubled expression, Qinchuan felt rather curious. He asked, "Senior, you seem to have something you want to tell me." The celestial Dharch nodded gently and said to Qinchuan, "I do have some things I want to tell you, but I don't know how to start." Qinchuan could not help but feel even more curious when he saw how troubled the celestial Dharch was. He asked, "Senior, if there's anything you want to say, just say it. I'm fine with it." When the Heavenly Emperor heard this, he looked at Qinchuan with a complicated gaze and said, "In that case, I'll be straightforward." The celestial Dharch immediately told Qinchuan about some of the things that had happened in the past month. Qinchuan's face became extremely ugly when he heard the celestial Thearcha's description. "We've done a comparison. Compared to the previous month, during the month you were in seclusion, the probability of a Thunder Dao cultivator having a problem increased by 200%. They must have been affected by the power of oaths and wishes." The celestial Dharch stopped and waited for Qinchuan's reaction. However, judging from Qinchuan's expression, Qinchuan was in a very bad mood right now. He was willing to accept the help of heaven and atheists because he did not want to hurt others. However, in order to make way for him, they were all greatly affected. Some people only lost their cultivation, but some lost their lives. This made Qinchuan feel very guilty. "This is my mistake." Qinchuan felt very guilty, but it had already happened. He really did not know how to fix it. Seeing the guilty expression on Qinchuan's face, the celestial Dharch asked, "Qinchuan, what do you plan to do?" Hearing the celestial Thearcha's question, Qinchuan was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "What will happen if I stop cultivating now?" The celestial Dharch helplessly said to Qinchuan, "Then what you said when you swore will become a reality." Hearing this, Qinchuan took a deep look at the Heavenly Emperor and asked, "Senior, before I made the oath, did you know that something like this would happen?" "Qinchuan, this matter is beyond the control of the heavens. Once you make the oath, the power of the oath and the power of will automatically take effect. Everything will happen naturally. No one will push it, and no one will directly participate in this matter. Just like the battle between Lei Gu and Lei Ye from the Thunder Clan. Do you think that without you, the two of them would be able to get along peacefully? In order to obtain the Thunder Herb, they would definitely fight. The outcome of one of them dying and one of them being injured was already decided when the Thunder Herb appeared." Qinchuan looked at the celestial Dharch with a complicated expression and said, "If it wasn't for me, perhaps the Thunder Herb wouldn't have appeared." The celestial Dharch sighed and said, "Qinchuan, you are going down a dead end." Qinchuan pursed his lips and said, "Perhaps Senior still thinks that I'm a particularly pretentious person. I've already obtained all the benefits, but I still have to pretend to be compassionate and sympathetic. Like a fox mourning the death of a rabbit." That's not what I meant. The celestial Dharch was helpless and said to Qinchuan, I am only conveying Senior Heaven's message. If you have any questions, you can ask Senior Heaven directly. Chapter 14:12. On a beautiful grassland, Heaven was sitting on the ground with a book in his hand. He was quietly reading it. Senior. Qinchuan slowly walked over from afar and stopped in front of Heaven. Heaven looked up at Qinchuan, then pointed at the empty space in front of him and said to Qinchuan, Sit down and talk. Qinchuan sat down in front of Heaven and whispered, Senior Heaven Emperor has told me everything. I didn't expect so many things to happen in the 1 month I was in seclusion. Hearing Qinchuan's words, Heaven asked, You feel very sad and can't accept this fact? Qinchuan nodded. I once said that I don't want my success to be built on the sacrifice of others. Heaven looked at Qinchuan and suddenly handed the book in his hand to Qinchuan. Take a look at this book. Qinchuan reached out with his hand to receive the book from Chang Tian. After giving it a glance, he could not stop himself from revealing a look of shock. Truth be told, this was not a book. Rather, it was a book that recorded the names of lightning cultivators from various places. Some lightning cultivators had fallen due to various reasons, while some were still alive. Qinchuan silently looked at the contents of the list. After reading it, Qinchuan asked Heaven, Senior, why are you showing this to me? Are you trying to tell me that many thunder cultivators have encountered various problems in the past, and that what happened in the past month has nothing to do with me? Heaven shook his head and said to Qinchuan, What I'm trying to tell you is to remember the names of the people on this list. Once you reach the pinnacle in the thunder domain, you can think of a way to repay them. Hearing Heaven's words, Qinchuan was stunned for a moment. He asked doubtfully, They're already dead. How can I repay them? Heaven smiled and said to Qinchuan, They have indeed reached the end of their lives in this life, but they still have a next life. Qinchuan was a little startled and said in surprise, Next life? Heaven nodded and told Qinchuan, It is indeed the next life. In this life, because you want to become a peak existence, they will have to make way for you. But in the next life, you will be able to repay them greatly. Before Qinchuan could say anything, Song Tian asked, If it were you, would you be willing to work hard in your cultivation in this lifetime, and become an overlord of the body integration stage at the most? Or would you be willing to cultivate for another lifetime with the help of a supreme being in the hopes of entering the tribulation stage, and becoming a supreme being or even a demigod? Hearing Heaven's words, Qinchuan could not help but be dumbfounded. There was actually such a thing? However, Qinchuan quickly reacted. He frowned and said to the heavens, But we didn't discuss this with them beforehand. Moreover, in the next life, will they still be them? Hearing Qinchuan's question, Heaven smiled and said to Qinchuan, It is precisely because we didn't discuss this with them beforehand that we have to repay them double and compensate them. Once you become a supreme being, it will be very easy for you to help them become supreme beings in the tribulation stage. Qinchuan smiled bitterly and said, But I still feel that this is a little inappropriate. Qinchuan felt very helpless. He knew very well that Heaven's solution was the best one he could think of at the moment. However, he still felt that doing this was a little disrespectful of other people's opinions. It was like acting first and reporting later. Seeing Qinchuan's helpless expression, Heaven frowned. He looked at Qinchuan and said sincerely, Qinchuan, with your mentality, even if you have the strongest battle strength, you will not be able to become a supreme being. Hearing Heaven's words, Qinchuan could not help but fall silent. He knew very well what kind of person he was. Seeing Qinchuan fall silent, Heaven could not help but sigh and said, You are a powerhouse, a demigod, a supreme being in the future, a true god. Do you only have this little vision when doing things? It is good to be kind, but if you are too kind, then it will not work. At this point, Heaven pointed at the name list in Qinchuan's hand and asked, "If Zadie and you return one day, how many people on this name list do you think will be able to survive?" Qinchuan could imagine that if you and Zadie returned one day, not to mention the people on this name list, it was unknown how many people in the entire universe would be able to survive. They are indeed sacrificing themselves for your selfishness, but your selfishness is for the greater good. If you are unable to become a supreme being in a short period of time, we will not be able to resist the Void Empire and you. Heaven looked deeply at Qinchuan and said, "According to the information I received, Zadie and the Saint Emperor will soon come to the Celestial Cluster to take revenge for what happened last time. This time, the Saint Emperor will also bring along the awakened insect queen that has become a divine artifact." Hearing Heaven's words, Qinchuan was shocked and hurriedly asked, "When did this happen?" "Not long ago. I'm guessing that when they arrived, you might not have been able to become a supreme being." Heaven looked at Qinchuan and said in a very serious tone, "Qinchuan, time waits for no man. Under the current circumstances, if sacrificing a few thunder cultivators can help you become a supreme being, it is completely worth it. If you think it's inappropriate, we will release this information and ask everyone in the universe. Let's see how many people will think it's not worth it." Using the lives of a few thunder cultivators, who were at most at the body integration stage, in exchange for a supreme being who could protect the entire universe, was it worth it? No matter where this question was put, it was worth it. The only person who was conflicted was Qinchuan. It was also because of this that Heaven first made Qinchuan swear an oath, and only told Qinchuan when the situation was irreversible. Faced with Heaven's words, Qinchuan fell silent. After a long time, he asked Heaven, "Can I meet these people on the list?" If Qinchuan wanted to become a supreme being, there were still many people on the list who had to pay a price. He wanted to meet these people personally and ask if they were really willing to sacrifice this life in exchange for power in their next life. Heaven nodded and said, "Of course, they are already on their way here. You will be able to meet them soon." Qinchuan was a little surprised and asked, "Senior, you have already made your plans?" Song Tian nodded again and said, "I didn't tell you this before because I hoped that what's done can't be undone and cut off your path of retreat. I guessed that you would want to meet these people after knowing about this, so I sent people to gather them long ago." Chapter 14:13. After hearing Heaven's answer, Qinchuan fell silent once again. It turned out that all of his reactions had been predicted by Heaven, and Heaven had already thought of a countermeasure long ago. From the very beginning, he had already fallen into Heaven's trap. Seeing that Qinchuan was silent again, Heaven continued, "Don't worry, I won't threaten them, and I won't collude with them in advance. I can assure you that before they came here, they definitely knew nothing about anything. This time, I won't lie to you again." The last time he lied to Qinchuan, he had no choice but to do so. If he lied to Qinchuan again this time, the trust between them, which had already become somewhat fragile, would really be in jeopardy. When Qinchuan heard Heaven's words, he was somewhat distressed and asked Heaven, "Senior, do you think that I'm an especially hypocritical person? I've already enjoyed all kinds of benefits and become a high and mighty demigod, yet I still have to consider the feelings of those low-level practitioners. Isn't that especially fake?" Qinchuan could feel that he was different from many people. In the universe, when a cultivator of a higher realm faced a cultivator of a lower realm, they would often have a condescending attitude. However, when facing a cultivator of a higher realm who was stronger than them, they would have a fawning attitude. If a Dongshu stage practitioner could gain the appreciation of a universe overlord, it could be said that he had received great benefit. In certain specific areas, he could almost do whatever he wanted. No matter what wrong he did, the universe overlord would come forward to solve it. Under normal circumstances, the universe overlord would directly suppress him with force. Speaking of reason, this kind of thing was almost impossible. Compensation was also almost impossible. In the universe, the law was a tool used by those with high authority to maintain their rule. The strong were never restrained by anything. The only thing that could restrain the strong were those who were even stronger. The reason why Zadir could do whatever he wanted in the universe, wantonly destroy planets, and wantonly kill people, was because he was an ultimate existence with great power. In the face of Zadir's bullying, practitioners of a lower level only dared to be angry but did not dare to say anything. If it were Thelon, Sharmila, Huang Feng, or Saint Baudelo beside Qinchuan, when faced with such a situation, perhaps they would not think so much and consider so many things. However, Qinchuan was different. He really could not get over the hurdle in his heart. Hearing Qinchuan's words, Heaven suddenly laughed. He laughed for a long time before saying to Qinchuan, "Qinchuan, this is not hypocrisy, but human nature. It is also because of your humanity that you have so many friends around you, have so many people willing to believe in you. That's why atheists and I are willing to help you." As one's realm got higher and stronger, it was very difficult for people to maintain their humanity and not raise it to divinity. From the way practitioners addressed each realm, it could be seen that everyone yearned for divinity. Those in the Dongshu realm were called almighty practitioners, those in the unification realm were called overlords of the universe, those in the tribulation realm were called supreme existences, and those in the ultimate realm were called gods. At the end of the day, the ultimate existences were just stronger people. However, some people turned stronger people into gods. This was because some people desired to become gods, to have the power to kill those inferior to them, to have divinity. No matter who it was, when one had been in a high position for a long time, they would develop a condescending attitude when facing those in lower positions. This was an inevitable thing. It was almost impossible for the strong and the weak to coexist peacefully. However, Qinchuan did it because of his humanity. Humanity. When Qinchuan heard Heaven's words, he could not help but feel a little surprised. Shouldn't everyone have humanity? If they didn't have humanity, would they still be human? Seeing the confusion on Qinchuan's face, Heaven smiled and said, "I could have hidden what happened to the Thunder Cultivator from you. However, do you know why I told Heaven Emperor to tell you? Because this is a test for you, or rather, a test for human nature." When he heard Heaven's words, Qinchuan realized that this matter was not as simple as it seemed. "Senior, please explain to me." Qinchuan looked at Heaven with a sincere gaze. Right now, he desired an answer. Heaven nodded and said, "Actually, I should give you a reasonable explanation because in our previous conversation, I still lied to you about some things. However, please believe me, this is part of the test. It is also a white lie because I want to make sure that the person I am helping is someone who is worthy of my help and can shoulder the heavy responsibility." Qinchuan was stunned when he heard that. After a long while, he asked Heaven, "Then, have I passed the test?" Heaven nodded, "Congratulations. You have successfully passed the test. If you hadn't, I wouldn't have said all this to you." Qinchuan looked at the sky with a subtle gaze and asked, "So, Senior, what you said just now is true and what is false?" Heaven pointed at the list in Qinchuan's hand and said to Qinchuan, "The Thunder Cultivators on the list have made some sacrifices because of you. It's true, but I didn't discuss it with them beforehand and didn't obtain their agreement. It's false." Qinchuan was extremely shocked when he heard Heaven's answer. He asked, "They all agreed?" Song Tian nodded and replied, "Before we found you and wanted to help you, we had already contacted these cultivators of the Thunder Tao and asked them if they were willing to use this life to exchange for a meteoric rise in their next life. Without exception, all of them chose to do so. After all, to them, even if they worked hard for their entire lives, perhaps the Unity realm would be their limit and it would be difficult for them to see the scenery of higher realms. However, with our promise, they can cultivate to the tribulation passing realm in their next life. At this point, Song Tian paused for a moment before continuing. If it weren't for the existence of the Millstone continent, we wouldn't be able to guarantee that they would definitely be able to raise their cultivation to the tribulation passing stage. Therefore, the right time, the right place, and the right people are on your side. Qin Chuan never thought that Heaven and Atheist would go to such lengths to help him ascend to the Paragon realm. Without waiting for Qin Chuan to say anything, Heaven continued, "There's one more thing. What I said earlier about not forcing or threatening the Thunder Dao cultivators was also true. As for some of the things that happened in this list, it's a mix of true and false." Heaven looked deeply at Qin Chuan and said, "Qin Chuan, not all cultivators maintain their humanity like you. Most cultivators still desire divinity. This is a fatal attraction to them." Chapter 14:14. After listening to Heaven's explanation, Qin Chuan basically understood Heaven's meaning. He looked at Heaven with a complicated gaze and asked, "So, from the moment we met, the test had already begun?" Heaven nodded and said to Qin Chuan, "That's right. At that time, you wanted to ascend to the pinnacle without harming anyone else. We were really happy. If you didn't clearly express your attitude at that time, we might not have helped you." To Heaven and Atheists, it wasn't difficult to help a demigod to ascend to the pinnacle without caring about the consequences. What was difficult was the person's temperament, the person's ability, and whether they could shoulder the heavy responsibility. No matter from which angle, Qin Chuan was their best choice. Firstly, in the past few decades, Qin Chuan had used facts to prove that he was a genius. Whether it was in the path of cultivation, the path of talisman arrays, or even the way he handled matters, he was excellent. Secondly, in the previous war, Qin Chuan used his charisma to conquer everyone. He was the strong and also the umbrella that protected the weak. Lastly, there was the connection between Qin Chuan and you. All along, you had been their number one enemy. Even if Heaven and Atheists worked together, they still didn't have the confidence to defeat you. However, Qin Chuan's existence was extremely good at restraining you's strength. Therefore, the stronger Qin Chuan was, the weaker you would be. It was also because of this most crucial point that they chose to help Qin Chuan ascend to the pinnacle. However, it was still the same thing. Even if Qin Chuan was the most suitable choice, if Qin Chuan couldn't pass the test of human form, they still wouldn't help Qin Chuan ascend to the pinnacle in a short period of time. Qin Chuan looked at Heaven and laughed bitterly. "So, at the very beginning, I expressed my attitude that I didn't want to implicate the innocent because of my ascension. That was the first test. Later, I asked the Sky Emperor to reveal the matter to me. That was the second test. I came to see you to talk about this matter. That was the third test. It really wasn't easy for me to pass the test you set." Qin Chuan finally understood that this test was one ring after another. If he didn't pass the first ring, then there wouldn't be a second ring, which was the one where the Sky Emperor told him those things when he came out of seclusion. If he didn't feel guilty, sad, or even want to give up on continuing to cultivate, then he wouldn't have been able to pass the second ring's test. The third loop was the final name list. It was also the last move that allowed Qin Chuan to meet the lightning cultivators. It was also because he passed these three tests that the heavens told him the truth. Heaven smiled and said to Qin Chuan, "This test isn't hard for you. Before testing you, we've done thousands of simulations. The probability of you failing is only 0.9%. Hearing this, Qin Chuan grinned and asked, "We've talked so much, but I still want to see those Thunder Dao cultivators with my own eyes before I can feel at ease. I'm really afraid this is another test." When Heaven heard this, he laughed out loud. Chatting with Qin Chuan was truly an interesting thing. 2 days later, Qin Chuan met the lightning cultivators that heaven had gathered in the first zone. The lightning cultivators that were gathered here were at least at the Dongshu stage. The strongest was at the peak of the combination stage. Qin Chuan walked onto the aircraft carrier. There were hundreds of thousands of lightning cultivators on the deck. When they saw Qin Chuan, they were all very excited. It really is Qin Chuan. Those people didn't lie to us. It really is Qin Chuan. That's great. I finally have a chance to reach the tribulation stage. I must become the strongest. Even if I have to cultivate again, I won't hesitate. Everyone on the deck cheered excitedly. Before they came, they were still doubting whether this was true or not. Now that they saw Qin Chuan in person, they no longer had any doubts. Qin Chuan's rise had long become a legend. He used a short few decades to walk a path that others might not be able to walk in their lifetime or even their next life. Walking to such a height, there was no one who did not envy Qin Chuan. There was no one who did not want to be like Qin Chuan, standing at the highest peak overlooking the scenery below. Therefore, when this opportunity was placed in front of them, they did not hesitate to accept it. Exchanging a hopeless life for a meteoric rise in the next life was not a bad thing. For some people who were nearing the end of their lifespans, it was even a great thing. Of course, this exchange had to be built on a foundation that was trustworthy. If it was just a pie with no hope, no one would agree to the exchange. Everyone, quiet down. When Qin Chuan opened his mouth to speak, the noisy scene instantly quietened down. Everyone turned their gazes towards Qin Chuan, their faces filled with yearning and anticipation. Faced with everyone's gaze, Qin Chuan did not waste any time. He directly pointed at an old man at the peak of the combination realm and asked, "You are now at the peak of the combination realm. Are you really willing to give up your current cultivation and cultivate again in the next life?" The old man was called out by Qin Chuan. After hearing Qin Chuan's words, he did not immediately answer Qin Chuan's question. Instead, he asked, "Excuse me, are you really going to help me reach the tribulation transcendence stage in the next life after you become an ultimate existence?" Qin Chuan nodded and said, "As long as you're willing to make this exchange, I have no objections." Hearing Qin Chuan's affirmative answer, the old man smiled and said, "Of course I'm willing. I only have less than 300 years left in this life, and there's no hope for me to reach the tribulation transcendence stage. If I can use my current cultivation to reach the tribulation transcendence stage in the next life, why would I have any objections? I can't wait for someone to make such an exchange with me." The old man's words resonated with everyone. Some of them were nearing the end of their lifespans like the old man, some of them were not talented enough, and some of them had reached the limit of their comprehension of the laws because a supreme existence was about to be born in the lightning law domain. They were almost at a standstill. In this situation where there was no hope for further improvement, they were naturally willing to make such an exchange. When Qin Chuan heard the old man's answer, he could not help but reveal a complicated expression. Just as the heavens had said, in his eyes, this exchange was not fair. However, in the eyes of others, this exchange was what they wanted in their lives. Chapter 14-15. After that, Qin Chuan randomly picked a few people to ask. Without exception, all of them wished for better development in their next life. As for this life, it was like leveling up a useless account in a game. Leveling up a new one was a normal choice. During this process, Qin Chuan hoped to see some dissatisfaction or fear on some people's faces. However, all he saw was anticipation. Everyone standing here was looking forward to better themselves in their next life. As for this life, Qin Chuan was destined to become a supreme existence. With Qin Chuan's strength, he could easily wipe them out. No one would dare to say that Qin Chuan was an army. However, Qin Chuan chose to use such a troublesome method to exchange with them. This really made them feel flattered. As low-level cultivators, this was the first time a high-level cultivator cared about their feelings so much. They had mixed feelings. After asking hundreds of people, Qin Chuan gave up on asking more. He chatted with these people for a while before returning to the grassland and looking for Tsang Tian again. Tsang Tian sat on the ground making tea. When he saw Qin Chuan, he invited Qin Chuan to sit down. He asked Qin Chuan, "It's over, right?" Qin Chuan nodded lightly and said, "I've seen those Thunder Dao cultivators. They all seem to yearn for better development in their next life. As for this life, they generally don't have much hope." Tsang Tian smiled and said to Qin Chuan, "This is human nature. If it were Rengar, in his place he would probably have just killed all of them. As for the consequences of doing so or whether it would damage his reputation, he didn't care. If he really did care, he wouldn't have worked with the sage emperor to kill him. For them who are used to being oppressed by high-level cultivators, it's their fortune to be able to meet you." Qin Chuan asked curiously, "Senior, if they want to cultivate again in their next life, how do they do it?" Facing Qin Chuan's question, Tsang Tian answered straightforwardly, "The Tian people have a secret technique called the sky rotation technique. Cultivators who cultivate the sky rotation technique can be reborn like ancient phoenixes. They can keep their current memories and cultivate again." Hearing Heaven's words, Qin Chuan scratched his head and asked awkwardly, "Senior, that..." Tsang Tian didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he saw the strange expression on Qin Chuan's face. He interrupted Qin Chuan and asked, "Are you going to ask me if their parents know where their children came from when they reincarnate?" Qin Chuan's expression became even more awkward when he heard Tsang Tian's words. That's right, he wanted to ask this question. If he didn't ask, he would feel very uncomfortable. Tsang Tian looked at Qin Chuan's awkward expression and bitterly smiled. "I really have to hand it to you. You're even more long-winded than my teacher." Tsang Tian's teacher was the previous Tsang Tian. He had been constantly nagged by his teacher when he was young. Now, Qin Chuan actually made him feel like he was young again. He really didn't know what to say. "Don't worry, the Tian people's sky rotation technique allows cultivators to cultivate again and not reincarnate. They don't need parents and can directly return to their childhood." Qin Chuan was dumbfounded when he heard Tsang Tian's explanation. He asked, "There's such a thing?" Tsang Tian nodded. "The sky rotation technique has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that you can cultivate again and retain the memories of your previous life. The disadvantage is that the conditions of this new life are uncertain. You might become a genius or a piece of trash. It all depends on luck." "I see." Qin Chuan gently nodded. If that was the case, it made sense. Otherwise, the sky rotation technique would be a bit too perverse. The sky rotation technique is a secret technique of our Tian people. It's almost never taught to outsiders. If it weren't for the fact that the situation this time was a bit too severe, I wouldn't have tried this. Tsang Tian looked at Qin Chuan with a solemn expression. "You don't have much time left. You have to become a supreme existence as soon as possible." Qin Chuan nodded and said firmly, "I will definitely work hard and strive to become a supreme existence in the shortest time possible." New Universe Calendar, Year 1463, May. After Zadir recovered to his peak condition, the Saint Emperor and Zadir set off for the Celestial Cluster. They were prepared to find Tsang Tian to avenge Zadir. A month ago, the Saint Emperor had already inadvertently revealed this information to Tsang Tian through a secret channel. Now that a month had passed, Tsang Tian should have already made preparations. Zadir probably wouldn't be able to return from this trip. On the way to the Celestial Cluster, Zadir glanced at the glove on the Saint Emperor's right arm and chuckled. "Saint Emperor, I heard that the Insect Queen is beautiful. Is that true?" Although Zadir saw the Insect Queen appear last time, he didn't see it very clearly under the circumstances. He only vaguely saw the Insect Queen's appearance, so he was very curious about what the Insect Queen looked like. Hearing Zadier's question, the Saint Emperor's face suddenly turned gloomy. He looked at Zadier with a sharp gaze and asked coldly, "What are you trying to say?" Zadier grinned and said, "Don't misunderstand. I don't have any improper thoughts about the Insect Queen. I just want to remind you, brother. Don't play any tricks with me. If you try to be clever and end up losing your life, it won't be good if the god item falls into the hands of others and you lose the beauty." The Saint Emperor looked deeply at Zadier and snorted coldly. "If you don't trust me, I can return to the Sage Monarch continent right now. Haha, I'm just saying. Don't take it seriously." Zadier laughed, then said to the Saint Emperor, "By the way, I've already sent word back to the Void Empire about this matter. If I don't return alive, you will personally avenge me. I hope you're mentally prepared, brother." Hearing Zadier's words, the Saint Emperor frowned slightly and asked, "I thought you can't leave the Void Empire?" Zadier looked at the Saint Emperor strangely and asked, "Who told you that you can't leave the Void Empire? Was it me? Did I say something like that?" Seeing Zadier acting crazy, the Saint Emperor suddenly felt that his and the Insect Queen's plan to kill with a borrowed knife wasn't going to go smoothly. He really couldn't understand this crazy Zadier. Chapter 14:16. As the saying goes, a shameless person is invincible. In the eyes of the Elysian Emperor, Zadie was such a shameless person. As a rank 1 magus, Zadie had extremely powerful combat strength, and similarly, he had an extremely strong mental fortitude. Otherwise, he would not have been able to lie without blushing. As for whether you would return to avenge Zadie after his death, the Elysian Emperor had no idea. If Zadie's death really led to Yu's return, then Zadie's death might not be a good thing. However, if Zadie did not die, then there was no way to weaken Yu's power. Thinking about it carefully, the Elysian Emperor suddenly realized that regardless of whether Zadie was alive or dead, it did not seem to be a good thing. After understanding this, the Elysian Emperor secretly communicated with the Insect Queen and asked, "You should have heard Zadie's words. Are we still going to continue with our previous plan?" "Why not?" The Insect Queen giggled. "He said that he had already told you about this matter." "Did he really tell you about it?" "He said that you would avenge him after his death." "Will you really avenge him?" Hearing the Insect Queen's words, the Elysian Emperor frowned slightly and asked, "You mean to say that Zadie's words cannot be trusted?" "Zadie is a madman. He is arrogant, conceited, and extremely suspicious. When we did not agree to join forces with him, he came looking for us again and again. When we agreed to join forces with him, he was worried that we might have other motives. I'm guessing that he did not do anything at all. He only said those words to you to scare you. Think about it. If you could really come out on his own, why didn't he come back earlier? With Yu's strength, if he came back, who do you think would be his match?" After hearing the Insect Queen's words, the Elysian Emperor thought about it carefully and felt that this was indeed the case. However, no matter what, the Elysian Emperor still felt uneasy. The Insectoid Queen was now one with the Holy Emperor. She could sense the uneasiness in the Holy Emperor's heart. She giggled and said to the Holy Emperor, "See, you're feeling uneasy, and Zadier has achieved his goal. At the critical moment, this uneasiness might cause you to hesitate when you act, causing the plan to fail." The Saint King's mood could not help but turn gloomy when he heard the Insect Queen's words. If not for the Insect Queen's reminder, he would not have even noticed that his heart had wavered because of Zadier's specious words. Such a thing should never happen to someone of his cultivation realm. The crack in his mental state had appeared after the Insect Queen had awakened. At the thought of this, the Holy Emperor's mind became firm. He said to the Insect Queen in a low voice, "Let's act according to our previous plan. No matter what the consequences are, we have to kill Zadie first." The Insect Queen smiled and said, "That's right." Given their speed, it only took them 2 days to get from the sage monarch continent to the celestial cluster. Zadir and the Holy Emperor didn't try to hide their tracks. They openly flew through the Iki Nebula and headed straight for Stansos. When Zadir and the Holy Emperor entered the celestial cluster, the high heaven had already sensed them. He wasn't sure if Zadir and the Holy Emperor would chase after him after he left Stansos. If that madman Zadir barged into Stansos, Stansos would cease to exist. Therefore, the high heaven had no choice but to face Zadir and the Holy Emperor head-on. Strangely and dramatically, the battlefield was once again set in the Iki Nebula. In fact, as early as a month ago, when they found out that Zadir and the Sage King were going to join forces, the heaven had already asked the Lord of Heaven to evacuate the residents of the Iki Nebula. Now, the Iki Nebula was almost empty. It could be said that they had minimized the possible losses as much as possible. When the high heaven appeared in the Iki Nebula, Zadir and the Holy Emperor were already waiting for him. When Zadir saw the Holy Emperor, he immediately laughed sinisterly and said to the high heaven, "You didn't expect me to be back, did you?" Seeing the standard villain's smile on Zadir's face, the high heaven snorted coldly. A defeated general doesn't deserve to be called a hero. Hearing the high heaven's mocking words, Zadir was enraged and was about to attack. He let out a low roar and swung his right fist. Void power surged out and turned into a dark purple giant monster that pounced at the high heaven. Seeing that Zadir attacked without saying anything, the high heaven didn't hold back. He immediately took out the Tian people's most precious treasure, the sky-concealing jade. The sky-concealing jade was a beautiful piece of jade that was born in ancient times. After thousands of years, it became a sacred weapon. Now that it had been nurtured by the high heavens for several generations, it had become a top-grade sacred weapon and had developed some spiritual intelligence. It was only one step away from becoming a divine weapon. When Firmament took out the sky-concealing jade, it released a warm light. It was like moonlight pouring down on the giant monster formed from void godly power. The giant monster melted like snow under the moonlight of 6 moons. You can't be thinking that you're the only one who has a sacred weapon. Seeing the high heaven take out the sky-concealing jade, Zadir immediately snorted and took out a thick leg bone. This leg bone was engraved with extremely evil words that exuded an eerie and terrifying aura. "Go!" Zephyr violently tossed the leg bone into the sky. The leg bone spun in the air like a boomerang as it flew toward the sky. When it was halfway there, a surge of void divine power suddenly gushed out of the leg bone and transformed into a sharp blade. It instantly tore space apart and caused the universe to tremble. In the face of this flying leg bone, the high heaven immediately used the divine power of oath to form a solid round shield in front of him. He tried to use the round shield to block the leg bone's attack. However, the high heaven underestimated the leg bone's power. The round shield couldn't even block the leg bone's attack for a moment before it shattered with a loud bang. However, the high heaven had already retreated. At the same time, he activated the sky-concealing jade again and sprinkled a ray of light on the leg bone. However, it didn't have any effect. At the same time, an extremely shocking pressure suddenly erupted from the leg bone. It actually faintly had the intention of suppressing the high heaven. It's useless. This leg bone of mine came from the legendary god of creation. It's a real god's bone, a divine weapon. Zadir laughed complacently and said something that shocked everyone. This leg bone came from the legendary god of creation? A divine weapon? Whether it was the high heaven or the holy emperor, their hearts were in turmoil. Zadir actually had a divine weapon in his hands. Just as the leg bone was about to hit the high heaven, a pure white jade statue suddenly appeared in front of the high heaven. The jade statue slowly raised its hand and actually sent the leg bone flying with a palm. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.